It started with the curtains. Plain beige curtains, the kind you'd find in any apartment where the landlord doesn't want to spring for blinds. I'd been living in my new place for less than a week when I noticed them. My neighbor across the way had the exact same ones, same color, same cheap fabric. But there was something off about how they hung in their window. Every morning at 8 o'clock sharp, they'd be wide open, sunlight flooding their living room. Every evening at 8 o'clock sharp, they'd be tightly drawn. I could set my watch to it. At first, I thought nothing of it. People have routines, right? Maybe my neighbor worked a strict schedule or had an obsessive-compulsive streak. But the precision bugged me. One night, out of curiosity, I stayed up to watch them close. At exactly 7:59, I saw movement, a figure I couldn't quite make out, tall and indistinct, as if I were watching through fog glass. At 8 o'clock, the curtains were drawn. No pause, no hesitation. It was unsettling in its efficiency, like watching a robot. The next day, I decided to introduce myself. I figured putting a face to the odd routine might ease my mind. Their mailbox read a Greaves, which told me nothing, but I knocked on the door anyway. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and heard faint footsteps behind the door. They didn't open it, though. Instead, a muffled voice called, "What do you want?" "Hi, I'm your neighbor," I said. "Just wanted to say hello. I live in 2B. Silence. Then the voice said, "Don't watch me." I laughed nervously, thinking I'd misheard. "Sorry. Don't watch me." The voice was sharper now, almost a growl. I backed away, muttering an apology, and returned to my apartment. Something about the encounter left me rattled. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they'd been delivered. Flat. Mechanical. Like the person behind the door didn't know how to inflect properly, as if they were mimicking human speech. After that, I made a point of ignoring the curtains, but it wasn't easy. They were directly across from my window, and every time I glanced outside, they seemed to loom in the corner of my vision. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that my neighbor was just private or eccentric. But then other things started happening. Little things at first. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway late at night, heavier than they should have been for one person. My front door handle jiggled once, twice, at 3 a.m. I told myself it was just someone drunk or confused. Then I started finding scratches on my door frame, long and deliberate, like something had been clawing at it. The curtains stayed the same, open at 8 a.m., closed at 8 p.m. I tried to avoid looking, but one night, around 7:55, I couldn't help myself. The light in their apartment flickered, casting strange shadows on the ceiling. I squinted, trying to make out the source of the disturbance, when the shadow shifted. It wasn't random. It was a figure, tall and angular, its limbs too long to be human. It moved toward the window, jerky and unnatural, and for a split second, I thought I saw its face. Pale, featureless, with two deep indentations where eyes should have been. The curtains closed. I didn't sleep that night. I called my building manager the next morning to ask about the neighbor. "Oh, you mean Greaves," he said. "They've been there forever. Quiet tenant. Never any trouble. Do you know anything about them?" I asked. "Their first name? What they do?" "Sorry, I don't. They've been here longer than me." That wasn't the answer I wanted. I spent the rest of the day digging through public records, trying to find any mention of a Greaves. Nothing. No utility bills, no voting history, no social media. It was like they didn't exist. That night, the scratching on my door was louder, more insistent. I didn't open it. I couldn't. The next day, I noticed the curtains weren't opening at their usual time. For the first time in weeks, they stayed closed through the morning, into the afternoon. Relief washed over me. Maybe they'd moved out or left town. But when I got home that evening, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written on old, yellowing paper, and the handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. 3 words: "You are watched." I spent the rest of the night with every light in my apartment on. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement outside my window. Not footsteps this time, but something heavier. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate. I crept toward the window, heart pounding, and pulled the blinds back just a crack. The curtains across the way were open, and there, pressed against the glass, was a face. Not human, not remotely human, but staring directly at me. Its skin was mottled gray, stretched too tight over its skull, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. It didn't move. It didn't blink. I slammed the blinds shut and locked myself in the bathroom. I didn't leave my apartment the next day. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside again, the curtains were closed, but my front door had been scratched so badly the paint was peeling. That night, I packed a bag and drove to my sister's place 3 towns over. I didn't tell her the full story, just said I needed a break from the city. When I came back a week later, the scratches on my door had been painted over. My building manager told me Greaves had moved out. I wanted to feel relieved, but I didn't. The curtains were still there, still open at 8 a.m. and closed at 8 p.m. And now, they're my dreams. Every night, I see them. Open, then closed. Open, then closed. And behind them, a shadow waiting, watching. At sunrise, the city stirred to life. But in the shadowy corners of its bustling streets, Lena maneuvered through the world unseen. Her every step a dance with obscurity. She was a master locksmith, but her trade wasn't merely about opening doors. Her true artistry lay in securing those that no one wanted opened, crafting mechanisms so intricate they seemed almost alive, their interlocking parts whispering secrets in the language of metal. The morning air carried a crisp chill, the kind that teased of an impending frost. As Lena reached the crumbling facade of a building slated for demolition, she felt the weight of her pack against her shoulder, a comforting reminder of the tools of her trade. She slipped inside, the scent of decay mingling with dust, as though time itself had exhaled in resignation. Her client was a wiry man with jittery hands and a voice that seemed to skitter around like a mouse in a trap. He called himself Marlowe. "Payments up front," Lena said, her tone steady. "I don't work on promises." Marlowe thrust a thick envelope toward her. The corner bore the oily smudge of nervous fingers. She waited briefly, then pocketed it. He pointed her toward a staircase that descended into the guts of the building, murmuring about a door no one could breach. She didn't need the backstory. They all had the same skeleton of desperation. The door was magnificent. Solid steel reinforced with layered composites, its surface brushed to an indifferent sheen that mocked the dilapidation surrounding it. Lena crouched to inspect the locking mechanism, her fingers brushing its surface like a lover reacquainting herself after years apart. It was beautiful in its complexity, a labyrinth of tumblers, plates, and a biometric reader now lifeless without its parent system. "I need silence," she told Marlowe without looking at him. He complied, retreating into the dark with a shuffle. Her tools sang softly as she worked, their metallic clicks and scrapes harmonizing with her breath. The lock yielded secrets reluctantly, each puzzle she solved leading to another. Time became irrelevant, the rhythm of her work a meditative trance. When the final barrier gave way with a subdued hiss, Lena felt a twinge of regret. No lock could ever remain unconquered. The door swung inward, revealing a vault-like room suffused with the stale air of long-forgotten secrets. She stepped in cautiously, her boots echoing on the cold floor. Rows of filing cabinets stood like sentinels, their metal faces reflecting dim light. At the center, a desk held a box the size of a microwave, secured by an additional layer of locks. Marlowe hovered at the threshold, his eyes gleaming with a hunger Lena had seen before. "Is it there?" he whispered. Lena frowned, unnerved by his fervor. "Whatever's in here, you've got 5 minutes before I'm gone." He brushed past her and set upon the box, his nimble fingers dismantling its defenses. The lid creaked open, revealing a collection of documents and a flash drive. His sharp intake of breath was almost reverent. "Careful what you wish for," Lena murmured, more to herself than him. She slipped out, the air heavy with the unspoken knowledge that she'd become a piece of something larger and far darker. Her boots traced her way back to daylight, but a growing unease clung to her like smoke. Marlowe's desperation hadn't been the cheap, petty kind she often encountered. It had teeth. That night, Lena dreamed of gears turning endlessly, their grind echoing with ominous inevitability. When she woke, the city seemed quieter, as though holding its breath. She was halfway through her morning coffee when the news flashed across her screen. A prominent corporate magnate had been found dead, his assets frozen, pending an investigation into extensive fraud. A blurry photograph of Marlowe appeared in connection, identified as a whistleblower now wanted for questioning. Lena felt the chill of recognition. She turned off the TV and reached for her phone. Before she could dial, the faintest sound caught her attention, a click from the door. Her trained ears knew it well. Someone tampering with the lock. Instinct kicked in. Lena grabbed her kit and slipped toward the fire escape. As she climbed, she heard the door burst open behind her, voices sharp and urgent. She didn't wait to hear what they said. On the rooftop, the air was biting, but freedom was tantalizingly close. She crossed to the adjoining building and disappeared into its labyrinthine corridors. Days turned into weeks as Lena moved from safe house to safe house. She avoided headlines, knowing they would only bring answers she didn't want. But the city whispered to her nonetheless. Stories of a whistleblower exposing the rot of powerful institutions, a string of sudden resignations, and dark murmurs of shadowy retribution followed her like a specter. It wasn't until a package arrived at one of her drop points that Lena confronted the reality she'd tried to ignore. Inside was a sleek black envelope containing a single photograph. Her, walking away from the vault, her face half turned in the dim light. Below it, a note: "We should talk. Midnight. The old clock tower." Against her better judgment, she went. The clock tower was a relic of another era, its cavernous interior a playground of shadows. Marlowe was waiting, his nervous energy now tempered with a chilling calm. "You've been busy," she said, leaning against a pillar. "So have you," he replied, holding up a manila folder. "This is everything they have on you." Lena bristled. "Why bring me here?" He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "Because they'll come for both of us. And because I know a way out." Trust was a currency she rarely traded in, but desperation had a way of leveling the playing field. As they planned their next move, Lena realized she'd crossed a threshold. The locks she once mastered were nothing compared to the labyrinth she was now ensnared in. And in this game, there was no door to keep the wolves at bay. The night was supposed to be uneventful, just another shift at the 24-hour diner on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that existed in its own time warp, where the jukebox still crooned songs from decades past, and regulars came not just for the greasy food, but for the comfort of the familiar. I had taken the late shift because the extra pay helped cover rent, and honestly, I didn't mind the solitude. It was usually quiet, save for the occasional trucker or insomniac looking for coffee and pie. At 2:37 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. I glanced up from wiping down the counter, expecting the usual disheveled traveler. Instead, a man in a dark hoodie and jeans walked in. His face was partially hidden by the hood, but something about the way he moved, calm, deliberate, made me uneasy. He didn't look at the menu or the specials board. He didn't even glance around. He headed straight for a booth in the corner, the one furthest from the windows. I forced a smile as I approached him, notebook in hand. "What can I get for you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Just coffee," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. His hands, I noticed, were shaking slightly as he passed me a 20. "Keep the change." I nodded and went back to the counter, my mind racing. The diner was empty except for him and me. I poured his coffee, my hands trembling, and brought it over. "Here you go," I said, placing the cup in front of him. He didn't reply, just stared out the window into the darkness, even though there was nothing to see but the faint glow of the parking lot lights. As I walked back to my post behind the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The man barely touched his coffee. Instead, he kept glancing at the clock on the wall, then at the door. I tried to focus on restocking the napkins and wiping down surfaces, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. Then, at 3:03 a.m., another car pulled into the parking lot. It was an old, beat-up sedan, its headlights cutting through the fog that had rolled in. The car parked but didn't turn off. The man in the hoodie tensed visibly, his hand darting into his pocket. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. The diner's door creaked open, and two more men walked in. They looked rough, leather jackets, tattoos, the kind of guys you didn't want to meet in a dark alley. They scanned the diner, their eyes locking onto the man in the hoodie. "There you are," one of them said, his voice cold and sharp. The man in the hoodie didn't respond. Instead, he slid out of the booth, his hand still in his pocket. "You didn't have to follow me here," he said, his tone strained. "We warned you about running," the other man said, stepping closer. "Thought you could hide in some backwater diner?" I backed up slowly, my heart pounding. I was trapped. The phone was at the far end of the counter, and I wasn't sure I could reach it without drawing attention. "Let's not do this here," the man in the hoodie said, his voice steady but tense. "Oh, we're doing this now," the first man said, pulling out a knife. The dim light of the diner made the blade gleam, and I felt a wave of cold terror wash over me. "Please," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Take it outside." The men ignored me. The man in the hoodie moved suddenly, pulling something from his pocket. My breath caught as I realized it was a gun. He aimed it at the two men, his hands shaking but his grip firm. "Back off," he said. "I don't want to use this." The tension in the room was suffocating. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The other men hesitated, their eyes darting between the gun and each other. "You think you can scare us?" One of them sneered, though his bravado was faltering. "I think you should walk away," the man in the hoodie replied. His voice had a steel edge now, a kind of quiet determination that made my stomach churn. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if on some unspoken cue, the two men stepped back toward the door. "This isn't over," one of them growled before they turned and walked out. The man in the hoodie didn't lower the gun until the car in the parking lot roared to life and sped off into the night. When it was gone, he let out a shaky breath and placed the gun on the table. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at me for the first time. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with a mixture of exhaustion and guilt. I didn't know what to say. My legs felt like jelly, and my hands were trembling so much I had to grip the counter to steady myself. "They would have killed me," he said quietly. "Thank you for not calling the cops." I didn't reply, just nodded numbly. He stood, leaving the untouched coffee and the gun on the table, and walked out into the foggy night. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at the gun, my mind reeling. The bell above the door chimed again as the wind pushed it slightly, and I jumped, my nerves shot. By the time the sun rose, the diner felt like a different place. The regulars came in, laughing and chatting as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the memory of that night, the way it had felt like standing on the edge of something dark and unknowable. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he had done to make those men come after him. But every time I hear the bell above the door chime, I feel a jolt of fear, half expecting him to walk back. I've always loved the solitude of late-night runs. There's something hypnotic about the rhythmic thud of my shoes on the pavement, the cool air biting at my skin, and the quiet hum of a sleeping neighborhood. It was my way of decompressing after long days at work, and I never gave much thought to the potential dangers of wandering the streets alone at night. Until last summer, it started as any other evening. I'd wrapped up a marathon session of emails and deadlines, laced up my running shoes, and stepped out into the warm, moonlit night. My neighborhood wasn't exactly bustling during the day, let alone at midnight. A suburban pocket just outside the city, it was the kind of place where porch lights stayed on and dogs barked at the occasional stray cat. Safe, ordinary, familiar. I decided to take a longer route that night, looping around the nearby park. The park was always the highlight of my run. The trees formed a dense canopy, and the faint glow of lampposts gave it a dreamlike quality. It was peaceful, a little eerie, but in a way that felt comforting, until it didn't. About halfway through the park, I noticed a figure sitting on one of the benches. It wasn't unusual to see someone out this late. Teens often hung out there, smoking or laughing in hushed voices. But this person was alone, sitting unnaturally still. Their posture was rigid, head tilted slightly as if listening for something. I almost didn't register them at first, too caught up in my own world. But as I passed, I felt their eyes latch onto me, heavy and cold, dragging my attention back like an anchor. I don't know why, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Something about the way they just watched. They didn't call out or move, but their presence pressed against me like a physical weight. I told myself to keep running, to ignore the nagging feeling clawing at the edge of my mind, but I couldn't shake the unease. I glanced back just for a second. They hadn't moved, but their head had turned, following me. And that's when I noticed it, a glint of something metallic in their lap. A knife? A flashlight? I couldn't be sure, but the sight was enough to spike my adrenaline. My pace quickened, legs pumping harder as I put distance between us. The path curved around a small pond, and for a brief moment, I was out of sight. I took the opportunity to slow down and catch my breath, straining to listen. The park was silent except for the rustling of leaves and the occasional croak of a frog. No footsteps, no voices. I started to feel silly for overreacting. Maybe they were just a harmless weirdo enjoying the night. I laughed nervously to myself, shaking off the tension, and started jogging again. But then I heard it, a faint crunch of gravel behind me. I froze mid-step, heart hammering. The sound stopped too, like it had been mirroring me. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the shadows. At first, I saw nothing. The path behind me was empty, bathed in pale light from the nearest lamppost. Then, just at the edge of the illumination, I saw them, standing still, partially obscured by the trees, watching me. They shouldn't have been able to catch up to me that quickly. My stomach twisted into a knot as I realized they must have cut through the trees while I'd been catching my breath. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and I chose flight. Without a second thought, I sprinted down the path, lungs burning, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare look back. The park exit was just ahead, a welcoming halo of streetlights at the edge of civilization. I could hear footsteps now, quick and deliberate, closing the gap between us. I pushed myself harder, every muscle in my body screaming as I tore through the exit and onto the quiet street beyond. For a fleeting moment, I felt relief. I was out of the park, out of the shadows. But when I glanced over my shoulder, they were still following. The figure was closer now, their features still obscured, but their intent unmistakable. They weren't just walking, they were chasing me. I veered toward the nearest house, a modest single story with a porch light glowing faintly. I scrambled up the steps and started pounding on the door, shouting for help. There was no answer. The curtains were drawn, and the driveway was empty. My stomach dropped. I was on my own. Turning back toward the street, I saw them standing at the edge of the property, just beyond the pool of light cast by the porch. They were still now, just watching the way they had on the bench. But the menace was palpable, radiating from them like heat. "Get away from me!" I shouted, my voice cracking. My hand fumbled for my phone, pulling it from my pocket with shaking fingers. I dialed 911, keeping my eyes locked on the figure. As the line connected, they tilted their head again, a strange, almost curious gesture. And then, without a word, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived 20 minutes later. By then, the figure was long gone. I gave them a description, what little I could make out in the dim light, and they promised to patrol the area. But the look on the officer's face told me they didn't expect to find anyone. I went home that night, locked every door and window, and sat in the dark with a kitchen knife clutched in my hand, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. I haven't been back to the park since. I still run sometimes, but only in the daylight and always with pepper spray in my pocket. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't the first time they'd done this. Or the last. When I moved into the apartment, it felt like a fresh start. The building was old, sure, with creaky wooden floors and those big radiators that hiss like angry cats, but it had charm. It smelled faintly of lemon polish, and the landlady, Mrs. Dietrich, was the perfect mix of chatty and hands-off. She'd handed me the key, wished me good luck, and that was it. Just me and my new one-bedroom apartment, waiting to be filled with the life I was eager to rebuild. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking. Every box I emptied was a small victory. I arranged my books by author on the built-in shelves, hung up a few prints I'd thrifted, and even found the perfect corner for my favorite chair, a beat-up recliner my dad had passed down to me. It wasn't much, but it was home. The first odd thing happened a few days later. I came home after work, dropped my bag on the kitchen counter, and noticed something off. My recliner wasn't in its corner anymore. It was closer to the window, just slightly like someone had nudged it while cleaning. I brushed it off. Maybe I'd moved it without realizing it. I'd been distracted, lost in thought about my new job and the endless to-do list that came with starting over. I slid it back into place and forgot about it. But then it happened again. This time, it wasn't the chair. It was my bookshelf. One morning, I woke up, groggy and desperate for coffee, and walked past it on my way to the kitchen. Something made me stop. The books weren't in the order I'd arranged them. Authors were mixed up, titles completely out of place. It was messy, chaotic, the opposite of how I'd left it. I frowned, wondering if I'd accidentally done it in my sleep. Sleepwalking wasn't something I'd ever experienced, but stress can make people do weird things. I spent the next 20 minutes putting everything back in order. After that, the changes came faster. My kitchen utensils swapped drawers. A plant I kept on the windowsill was suddenly in the bathroom. And it wasn't just objects. One night, I came home to find the light bulb in my bedroom replaced with a dim, reddish one. I didn't own any bulbs like that. I called Mrs. Dietrich, but she swore up and down that no one else had access to my apartment. "You're the only one with the key," she said. "These old locks? They're impossible to pick." Her voice sounded reassuring, but it didn't help. Things escalated after that. I'd wake up to find all the cabinets open, their contents meticulously rearranged. The rug in the living room would be flipped over, exposing its threadbare underside. Once, I came home and found the word here written in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it sent a chill down my spine. I told myself it must have been me, that I'd written it without thinking. But the letters were too sharp, too deliberate, and I hadn't used a shower that day. I started locking the bedroom door when I went to sleep. It didn't help. I'd wake up to find myself in the living room, the TV on, playing static. Once I woke up standing in the kitchen, the faucet running. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. The worst part was the subtlety. Everything was just slight enough to make me question myself. I kept a journal, logging each change, trying to make sense of it. Was I being gaslit? Was someone breaking in? I set up my phone as a makeshift security camera one night, pointing it at the bookshelf. The next morning, I watched the footage. Nothing happened. And yet, when I checked the shelf, every book was upside down. It was around then that I noticed the apartment itself felt different. The walls seemed closer, like they were leaning in ever so slightly. The floor creaked louder, and the light through the windows seemed dimmer, even on sunny days. One night, I swore I heard whispering through the radiator, soft and rhythmic, like a chant in a language I didn't understand. When I tried to record it, the sound didn't come through. Just silence. Then came the night everything changed. I'd fallen asleep on the couch, a mistake I wouldn't make again. When I woke up, the room was wrong. The furniture wasn't where it should be. The recliner was gone entirely. My bookshelf had moved to the middle of the room, tipped over, its contents scattered. The walls were the wrong color, no longer beige, but a sickly gray-green. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like it was pressing against my skin. And the clock on the wall was spinning wildly, the hands moving so fast they were a blur. I stood up, heart pounding, and tried the front door. It wouldn't budge. The locks turned, the knob twisted, but the door stayed stubbornly in place. I ran to the window and froze. There was nothing outside. No streetlights, no buildings, not even darkness. Just a vast, empty whiteness that stretched endlessly in every direction. My reflection in the glass stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale, but there was something wrong with it. Its mouth moved, whispering words I couldn't hear. Panicking, I ran back into the living room and tripped over something. The recliner. It was back, but now it was facing the wrong direction, pointed toward a corner where I'd hung a mirror. In the mirror, I could see the room behind me, but it didn't match the room I was in. The walls were covered in writing, scratched in deep, jagged letters. The same word repeated over and over. Stay. I turned around, but the walls were clean. When I looked back at the mirror, the writing was closer, as if it were crawling toward the glass. I backed away, shaking, and bumped into something solid. Someone was standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Just empty air. A sound came from the mirror, a low, guttural laugh. My reflection wasn't laughing, though. It was staring at me, expressionless, its eyes dark and hollow. That was when the lights went out. The room plunged into complete darkness, and the air grew colder, sharp with the smell of burnt hair. I couldn't see, but I could feel something moving around me, circling, brushing past me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, suddenly everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, and I was alone again. The apartment looked normal. The walls were beige, the furniture was back in its rightful place, and the clock was ticking normally. But I knew better. I knew something had shifted. I could feel it deep in my bones. I packed a bag that night, but when I tried to leave, I couldn't. The front door opened, but the hallway was gone. In its place was a brick wall, smooth and unbroken. I tried the window again, but outside was still that endless, blinding whiteness. Now I sit in the recliner, staring at the mirror. It's the only thing that doesn't change. My reflection is still there, still watching me, but its hollow eyes are no longer empty. Something is inside them now. It started with a call at 3:17 a.m. I work night shifts at a tech support center, so I'm used to weird hours, but this was my night off. Groggy, I reached for my phone and saw unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but answered anyway. The voice on the other end wasn't what I expected. It was my own voice. "Hello," it said, exactly as I just had. I froze. It wasn't just similar. It was my voice, my tone, the way I answer the phone when I'm tired. I didn't speak. After a few seconds, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. It wasn't a recording, and it wasn't a coincidence. It was too perfect. But before I could fully process what had happened, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. It was a picture of my bedroom, taken from the corner near the ceiling. I looked around wildly. There was nothing there. No camera. No sign anyone had been in the room. I couldn't explain it. The photo was recent. My laptop was still on the desk. The blanket crumpled at the foot of the bed exactly as I'd left it. The timestamp said it had been taken 2 minutes ago. I called the police. They arrived quickly, swept the place, and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no hidden devices, no explanation. I felt stupid explaining what had happened, but the officers were polite enough. They left after reassuring me that it was probably some kind of elaborate prank. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been some weird scam, a deep fake, maybe, or some app one didn't know about. I reset all my passwords, installed new security software, and tried to put it behind me. But that night, just as I started to drift off, my phone buzzed again. Another picture. This one wasn't from my bedroom. It was from my living room. It showed me sitting on the couch, staring at my phone. My blood ran cold. I was wearing the exact clothes I had on right then. My phone was in my hand, illuminated in the photo exactly as it was in real life. I whipped around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. No sounds, no shadows, nothing out of place. I even checked the windows and door. Everything was locked. That's when I noticed something in the background of the photo, a shape in the hallway behind me. It was faint, almost like a smudge, but it had a vaguely human outline. My hands were shaking as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then the shape moved. I dropped my phone and bolted out of the apartment. I drove around aimlessly for hours, too scared to go back. Around dawn, I finally worked up the nerve to return. My apartment looked untouched, but everything felt wrong. The air was heavier, the silence thicker. I checked every corner, every closet, every possible hiding spot. Nothing. I thought about calling the police again, but what would I say? "Hey, I got a spooky text." They already thought I was crazy. For the next few days, nothing happened. I started to believe it was over, that maybe it really had been a prank or some kind of hallucination. But then, last night, I woke up to a low hum. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it seemed to vibrate through the walls. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I got up, walked around the apartment, and tried to track it down, but the sound didn't seem to have a source. It was just everywhere. Then I noticed the light under my bedroom door. I had turned everything off before going to bed, but now a faint glow was spilling out into the hallway. My stomach clenched. I didn't want to open the door. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. Something compelled me forward like I had no choice. My hand trembled as I turned the knob. The light wasn't coming from any lamp or device. It seemed to radiate from the air itself, casting long, flickering shadows that didn't make sense. The shadows moved even though nothing else did. My bed was perfectly made, my desk untouched, but there was something on the floor, a piece of paper. I picked it up. It was blank, but as I stared at it, words began to appear, handwritten in ink that seemed to bleed onto the page from nowhere. Stop looking. I dropped the paper and stumbled backward, my head spinning. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my teeth, my skull. The shadows on the walls stretched and warped, coalescing into that same faint human shape I'd seen in the photo. It stepped toward me, slow and deliberate. My brain screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure stopped just a few feet away. It had no face, no features, just an outline of darkness that seemed to suck the light out of the room. And then, in my own voice, it spoke. You shouldn't have answered. The world seemed to tilt. My knees buckled, and I hit the floor. When I came to, it was morning. The paper was gone, the shadows were gone, and the light was gone, but my phone was on the floor next to me. There was a new message. It was another photo. This one was taken from directly above me, looking down at my unconscious body. The timestamp said 3:17 a.m. I haven't told anyone about this. I don't think it would matter. Whatever this thing is, it's not going to stop. I feel it watching me, even now. Every time I look at my phone, I half expect to see another photo, another message. I don't know what it wants or why it's tormenting me, but I can't escape it. The hum is back tonight, louder than ever. I'm too scared to open my bedroom door, but I can see the light creeping in through the cracks. My phone just buzzed again. I haven't checked it yet. I don't think I want to. It started like any other Tuesday. I was in my tiny kitchen making coffee, mindlessly scrolling through my phone and waiting for the first sip of caffeine to ignite some kind of spark in my brain. The sunlight filtered in weakly through the blinds, casting the usual streaks of gold across my countertops. Everything felt painfully mundane until I noticed the clock on the microwave. It read 7:52 a.m., a time that felt familiar in the wrong way. I didn't think much of it at first. I'm not exactly a morning person, so maybe my brain just hadn't caught up yet. But as I reached for the coffee pot, I froze. I had already poured the coffee. My favorite mug, the chipped navy one with a constellation pattern, was sitting on the counter, steaming gently. I stared at it, then at the pot in my hand, which was still full of fresh coffee. My mind backtracked. Had I poured it, set it down, and completely forgotten in the span of 10 seconds? I picked up the mug. It was warm. I had definitely poured it. I chalked it up to sleep deprivation, dumped the coffee from the pot into the sink, and sat at the kitchen table with my drink. My cat, Luna, meowed from her perch on the windowsill. She had that same piercing cry she always used to announce her presence, but something about the sound made me shiver. It was too sharp, too echoey, like it lingered just a fraction longer than normal. By the time I left for work, I'd mostly forgotten the incident. My walk to the office was brisk and unremarkable. The same coffee shop on the corner was full of groggy commuters. The same busker played the same slightly out-of-tune guitar near the subway entrance. It wasn't until I got into the elevator at work that the strangeness began to creep in again. I pressed the button for the 12th floor and leaned against the mirrored wall. A few seconds in, the elevator jerked to a stop. The doors opened on the 5th floor, and a man in a navy suit stepped in. I didn't recognize him, but he gave me a polite nod. Something about his face struck me as wrong. Not in a grotesque way, but like a photo that's been subtly edited, just enough to make it uncanny. His smile didn't quite match the crinkle in his eyes. I looked away quickly, hoping to avoid awkward small talk. He pressed the button for the 7th floor, and we rode in silence until the elevator dinged and he stepped out. The doors closed, and I exhaled, relieved. But when they opened again, I was on the 5th floor. The same man in the same navy suit stepped in. I laughed nervously, gesturing at the buttons. "Guess you didn't make it the first time?" "Huh?" I said, hoping to diffuse the weirdness. He didn't respond, just nodded at me again with that same almost smile. He pressed the 7th floor button, and the elevator resumed its climb. I was too unsettled to say anything else, but I stole another glance at him. His face was identical to the first time. Every feature in the same precise arrangement, even down to the slight smudge on his left temple. When the doors opened on the 7th floor, I held my breath, half expecting him to step out and the doors to close on me again. But he turned and looked at me, still wearing that eerie, not-quite smile. "You're going to be late," he said, and then he was gone. When I reached the 12th floor, I felt a wave of relief as I stepped into the office, greeted by the familiar buzz of keyboards and ringing phones. But as I made my way to my desk, a prickling sensation crawled up my spine. My desk was different, not drastically, just enough to make me doubt my own memory. The coffee mug I kept there, a generic office giveaway with our company logo, was now a sleek black tumbler. My sticky notes, which I always arranged in neat rows, were scattered haphazardly. I looked around, hoping someone might notice my confusion, but no one paid me any attention. By lunchtime, the unease had grown unbearable. I told myself I needed air, needed to reset my brain. I went to the little park near the office, sat on a bench, and watched the pigeons. One of them, a fat gray one with a missing toe, waddled over to me. I had seen this pigeon before, several times in fact. It was a regular fixture of my lunchtime breaks. But as I tossed it a piece of my sandwich, a strange sensation washed over me. I had already done this, not just today, but at some indistinct, unreachable point in the past. The exact same pigeon, the exact same sandwich, the exact same cloud drifting lazily across the sky. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of the spiral. It was a text from my coworker, Jill. "Meeting in 5. Don't be late." I glanced at the time. 1:57 p.m. I swore under my breath, grabbed my things, and hurried back to the office. The meeting was uneventful, but when I returned to my desk, the changes were impossible to ignore. My chair, which I'd left slightly pushed out, was now neatly tucked in. The tumbler was gone, replaced by my original mug. My sticky notes were back in their meticulous rows. I stared at it all, trying to convince myself that someone had been playing a prank. But no one was looking at me, no one was laughing. My chest tightened. The rest of the afternoon passed in a fog. When I finally got home, I was exhausted and on edge. I unlocked the door and immediately noticed the smell. Something sweet, almost floral, that I didn't recognize. My cat, Luna, usually greeted me at the door, but she was nowhere to be seen. I called for her, my voice shaky, and she appeared from the bedroom, her tail puffed up like she'd been startled. I crouched down to pet her, trying to calm both of us. And then I saw it. My consolation mug, the one I'd left on the kitchen counter that morning, was sitting on my coffee table. It was full of steaming coffee. I don't remember making it. I don't remember drinking it. But the warmth of the mug in my hands felt disturbingly familiar. I stared at the clock on the wall. It read 7:52 p.m. It started with the door. Not a creak or a groan, just wrong. I couldn't explain it to myself, let alone anyone else, but my front door looked different that morning. The wood grain pattern wasn't the same. I'd stared at it countless times, fumbling for my keys, but that morning, it had a swirl where I knew there used to be a straight line. I chalked it up to being groggy and went to work. At the office, my coworker Lisa brought coffee, as she always did, and dropped it on my desk. But she smiled at me in a way that made my stomach turn. It was too wide, too toothy, like she was trying too hard to look friendly but had never practiced before. I laughed nervously, thanking her, but the smell of the coffee was off, too sour metallic. I didn't drink it. Throughout the day, things kept poking at me. My stapler had a logo I didn't recognize. The clock in the break room ticked a second too fast. Lisa hummed a song under her breath I'd never heard before, but everyone else seemed to know it, joining in with eerie synchronization. I told myself I was overtired. When I got home, The apartment smelled faintly of ammonia. It took me hours to pinpoint the source. A single flower in the vase on my kitchen counter. I didn't own a vase. I didn't own flowers. I tossed it in the trash. But as I fell asleep that night, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone had been there, rearranging things just slightly out of place. My bookshelf felt wrong. The titles looked familiar, but the font on the spine seemed off. The days blended together, the unease compounding. One evening, I walked past my neighbor, Mr. Carver, the retiree who always sat on his porch. He was carving a block of wood, as usual, but the shape looked grotesque, a jagged, writhing thing that made my stomach churn. He glanced up, and his eyes were the wrong color. Brown, not blue. I opened my mouth to comment, but stopped short. Something deep in me screamed not to. "Evening, Sam," he said, smiling that too wide smile. I nodded and hurried inside. I locked the door behind me, heart racing, every nerve in my body screaming danger. The shifts were subtle but constant. The cashier at the grocery store started wearing a name tag that read Martin instead of Matt, even though I'd known him for years. A park near my apartment had always had 5 swings, but now there were 4. I tried to talk to my friends, but they laughed it off, their voices sounding strange in a way I couldn't articulate. Their laughter lingered in my ears too long, echoing when it shouldn't. One night I snapped. My best friend, Megan, was at my place, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Do you remember when we went to that diner on 5th last month?" I asked. She tilted her head, frowning slightly. "Diner? There's no diner on 5th, Sam." My blood ran cold. "Yes, there is. We went there. You ordered waffles, and I got that greasy burger I hated." Her smile returned, stretched too tight. "I think you're imagining things." She left shortly after, and I sat on my couch, staring at the blank TV screen. My own reflection looked foreign. Was my nose always that shape? Was my hair always that shade of brown? I grabbed my phone to call my mom, but when she picked up, her voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Mom," I said hesitantly. "Yes, sweetheart." The words were right, but the cadence was wrong. "Are you okay? You sound different." "Different," she repeated, as though tasting the word. "No, honey, everything's fine." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, dread curling in my stomach. I couldn't sleep that night, the quiet too oppressive. The next morning, I woke up to find a photo on my nightstand, a photo I'd never seen before. It was me, standing with a group of people I didn't recognize, all of us smiling. My heart thundered as I stared at it. The room in the background was unfamiliar, the wallpaper garish and green. I didn't own any clothes like the ones I was wearing in the picture. I tried going about my day, but everything felt more wrong than ever. The people on the subway all turned to look at me at the same time as the train pulled into the station. The barista at my usual coffee shop handed me a drink I hadn't ordered, but insisted it was my usual. At work, Lisa's desk was empty, and when I asked where she was, no one seemed to remember her. My coworkers looked at me with those wide, toothy smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Who's Lisa?" they asked in unison, and I felt like I was going to be sick. By the time I got home, I was shaking. I locked the door and checked every window, every corner, but nothing seemed out of place, except everything was. The apartment felt like a copy of itself, just slightly wrong, as if someone had built it from a vague memory of what it should be. I sat on the couch, staring at my hands, trying to steady my breathing. My phone buzzed and I jumped. It was a text from Megan. "Come over. We need to talk." Against my better judgment, I went. Her apartment looked normal at first glance, but as I stepped inside, I noticed her walls were covered in photos. Dozens of them. All of me. Some were from events I remembered, but others weren't. In one, I was sitting at a table with people I didn't know, smiling like I belonged there. In another, I was in a hospital bed, eyes closed, tubes in my arm. I turned to Megan, my chest tightening. "What the hell is this?" Her smile didn't waver. "You don't remember?" she said, tilting her head like she was studying a strange animal. "You've been here before, Sam." My vision blurred as panic set in. "What are you talking about? This isn't real. None of this is real." She stepped closer, her eyes dark and endless. "Why do you think everyone's pretending? You're the one who doesn't belong." Her voice was calm, almost pitying. You keep trying to leave, but you always come back. Don't you get it? This is your home now. I stumbled backward, the walls closing in. The photos seemed to shift, the faces warping into something inhuman. I bolted out the door, my heart pounding in my ears. The street outside looked the same, but it felt like a facade, like the whole world was a poorly constructed set. I don't know where I'm writing this from. My apartment, maybe, or some version of it. The windows don't show anything anymore, just darkness. The photos from Megan's apartment are here now, covering my walls. I tried taking them down, but they just reappear. I don't know who I am anymore, or if I ever did. The world looks the same to everyone else, but I know the truth. It's not real. None of it is real, and I don't think I'll ever escape. I had always been an easygoing traveler, eager to immerse myself in new places and meet the people who made them come alive. When I took the 6-month work assignment in a sleepy coastal town, it felt like a welcome break from the chaotic grind of city life. The air was crisp with the scent of salt and pine, and the locals were friendly enough, offering nods and smiles as I strolled down the cobblestone streets. It felt safe, ordinary. And then I met Patrick. It was my second week in town when I first saw him. I had stopped at a quaint cafe after work, drawn by the promise of their world's best clam chowder. The place was nearly empty, and he sat at a corner table reading an old paperback. He looked up, caught my eye, and smiled, a warm, open expression that made me feel seen in a way that was almost too intense. When I placed my order and waited, he struck up a conversation. First time trying the chowder, huh? His voice was deep and easygoing. Trust me, it lives up to the hype. I smiled, a little shy, but grateful for the friendliness. We talked for a few minutes, nothing too personal. He told me he worked as a freelance photographer and that he'd been living in the town for a few years. I told him about my temporary assignment, editing a local magazine. By the time my food arrived, he was already leaving, waving a cheerful goodbye. It was one of those pleasant but forgettable encounters that happen when you're new in a small town. The next time I saw him, it was at the farmer's market on Saturday morning. He waved as if we were old friends. "Hey, chowder girl," he called, making me laugh. We walked together for a while, browsing the stalls, and he pointed out the best vendors. He seemed like the kind of guy who knew everyone and everything, effortlessly charming and helpful. When I picked up a bundle of sunflowers, he mentioned they were his mom's favorite. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later, as I arranged them in a vase, I realized I hadn't told him I was buying them for my mother's upcoming birthday. The interactions became more frequent after that. Patrick always seemed to appear when I was out alone. At the bookstore, he recommended a novel I'd been meaning to read. On a quiet hike along the coastal trail, he just happened to be photographing the waves crashing against the cliffs. His presence wasn't unwelcome. It felt like running into an old friend. But there were moments when something about him felt off. Once at a diner, he joined me uninvited while I ate breakfast. We chatted as usual, and then he said, "How was that meeting with your boss yesterday?" Sounded stressful. I froze mid-sip of my coffee. I hadn't told him about the meeting, or even that I'd had one. "Small town," he added with a wink, as if that explained everything. The more I thought about it, the more I began to notice strange details. He never asked me personal questions outright, yet he seemed to know so much about me. Little things like how I like my coffee, or what time I usually left for work. He mentioned a photo I'd posted to my private Instagram account, though I'd never accepted a follow request from him. I convinced myself it was all innocent. Maybe he'd overheard something or seen me around. But the unease lingered, creeping into my thoughts late at night. One evening, after a particularly long day, I stopped by the local bar for a drink. It was dark and cozy, the kind of place where you could disappear for an hour. I was halfway through my whiskey sour when Patrick walked in. He smiled when he saw me, but this time it didn't feel warm. It felt deliberate. He slid into the seat beside me without asking. "Rough day?" he asked, tilting his head in a way that felt too knowing. I nodded, keeping my answer short, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. Instead, he leaned closer. "You shouldn't walk home alone tonight," he said, his voice lower. "It's not safe." The statement sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't planning to walk home. I'd driven there, but he couldn't have known that. I forced a laugh. "I'll be fine. I said, my voice steady despite the sudden tightness in my chest. Patrick didn't respond. He just stared at me for a moment, then got up and left without saying goodbye. By the time I finished my drink and stepped outside, I was on edge. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, and the quiet was oppressive. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly as I walked to my car, convinced I was being followed. But when I turned the last corner, the street was empty. The following week, I started to see Patrick less often, though I couldn't shake the feeling he was still there, watching. Then, one night, I came home to find a single sunflower lying on my doorstep. My breath hitched as I stared at it, my mind racing. It could have been a coincidence. Maybe a neighbor left it there, or the wind had blown it over from someone's garden. But deep down, I knew Patrick had been here. I changed my routine after that. I started leaving earlier for work, taking different routes, avoiding my usual spots. I even deleted my social media accounts, hoping to disappear from his radar. For a while, it seemed to work. Weeks passed without any sign of him, and I started to relax, convincing myself that I'd overreacted. Then, last night, everything changed. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a soft scraping sound outside my window. My heart pounded as I lay there, straining to listen. The noise came again, a slow, deliberate drag against the glass. Summoning my courage, I crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. There was no one there, but when I looked down, I saw it. A bundle of fresh sunflowers tied with twine, sitting neatly on the windowsill. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the dark, clutching my phone, debating whether to call the police. What would I even tell them? That a guy who'd never threatened me, never harmed me, was somehow everywhere I went? That he knew things he shouldn't? It sounded paranoid, crazy even, but I couldn't deny the truth anymore. Patrick wasn't just a friendly stranger. He was something else entirely, something I didn't want to understand. This morning, I packed a bag and left town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my boss. As I drove away, my hands trembling on the wheel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, but the unease lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I don't know if I'll ever see Patrick again. I don't know if he's still watching me, or if I've finally managed to slip away. But every time I pass a sunflower field, my stomach twists, and I wonder, how far is far enough? The rain began its incessant drumming on the roof just as Alice discovered the note. She didn't notice the weather at first. Her focus was solely on the crumpled scrap of paper she'd found tucked behind the books in their shared office. The writing was hurried, the loops of the letters erratic, almost panicked. Thanks for last night. It read, I can't stop thinking about you. It wasn't signed, but Alice didn't need a signature. She knew the handwriting well enough. It was Claire's, the receptionist from Daniel's office, with her lilting laughter and two familiar greetings at every company dinner. The letter, that simple fragment of Claire's thoughts, was both a weapon and a puzzle. Alice felt its sharp edges and tried to piece together its mystery all at once. Memories surged, moments that had seemed innocuous until now. The late-night meetings, the sudden urgency for Daniel to keep his phone on silent. The cologne she'd never smelled before on him, but had once caught faintly when Claire hugged her goodbye at the last Christmas party. Alice told herself not to jump to conclusions. She folded the note back into its creases, placed it where she found it, and sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the rain sliding down the window. Her mind wandered to the advice her best friend Tara had given her years ago after Tara's own divorce. The truth always leaves fingerprints, even if you don't see them right away. The next morning, Daniel was his usual self, charming, distracted, and annoyingly unaware of the war now raging inside her. He hummed a tune she vaguely recognized as he buttered his toast, pausing only to check his phone whenever it vibrated. When he caught her watching him, he flashed a smile. "Big presentation today," he said. "Wish me luck." She did, like always, her words automatic and hollow. Alice didn't go to work that day. Instead, she decided to follow the faint fingerprints of truth, wherever they might lead. It began with a call to Daniel's office, pretending to be someone else entirely. The receptionist who answered wasn't Claire. It was another woman, new to Alice. But when she asked about Daniel, the pause was telling. Oh, Mr. Gray isn't in the office right now. He's, working remotely today. Alice felt her stomach drop. The lie wasn't even artful. The next few days unfolded like a bad detective novel. Alice tried to suppress her paranoia, but each passing hour only added to the evidence. She checked his phone while he was in the shower, something she had sworn she'd never stoop to. What she found wasn't a smoking gun, but the text exchanges with Claire were suddenly curt and void of the casual camaraderie she remembered. It was as if they were both trying too hard to sound professional. Then there were the stories that didn't add up. A dinner meeting that lasted until midnight. A weekend trip for team building she hadn't heard about until he was halfway out the door. Even his cologne, a new brand that he claimed was a gift from a client, seemed like a stranger's scent on the man she had married. Finally, there was the confrontation. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. It came out like a scream during a fight that started over something as mundane as whose turn it was to take out the trash. "Are you seeing someone else?" she demanded, her voice trembling but loud enough to echo through the house. Daniel froze mid-step. His hesitation was brief, but it was there, unmistakable. Then he laughed, a cold, deflective sound. "Alice, where is this coming from? You've been acting crazy lately." That word, crazy, was like gasoline to her fire. She unleashed everything. The note, the text, the lies about his whereabouts. He listened, his face shifting from disbelief to anger to something unreadable. "You went through my phone?" he snapped, ignoring everything else she had said. "You're deflecting," Alice replied, tears streaming down her face now. "Answer me." And then he did, but not with words. His silence was louder than any confession could have been. The room between them grew vast, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down like the ceiling was caving in. Over the next week, Daniel stayed at a hotel. He called and texted, insisting it wasn't what she thought, that Claire was just a colleague, that he had never crossed that line. But Alice knew, deep down, that something had shifted. Whether it was an actual betrayal or merely the cracks forming in their foundation, she couldn't tell. She only knew that trust, once lost, was a specter that never quite returned the same way. Months later, after the divorce papers were signed, Alice found herself sitting in a cafe across from Tara. They shared stories, laughed at old jokes, and for a brief moment, the heaviness of the past year lifted. "Do you regret finding that note?" Tara asked, her tone soft but curious. Alice thought about it, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "I regret not seeing the signs earlier," she said finally. "But no, I don't regret the truth. It hurts less than the lies did." The rain outside was relentless, but this time, it didn't feel oppressive. Instead, it was cleansing, like the world was finally washing itself clean. Alice leaned back in her chair and smiled. Not because she was happy, but because she was free. It started with a man on the train. Not that he stood out much. Average height, navy blue coat, a face neither handsome nor forgettable. But something about him snagged my attention. He sat across from me, knees nearly brushing mine in the crowded car, reading a paperback with a cracked spine. When he glanced up, our eyes met for a fraction too long, and he smiled, a fleeting, polite expression, the kind you might offer a stranger by accident. But his gaze lingered, sharp and assessing, like he was trying to place me. Then the train screeched to a halt at my stop, and I hurried off without looking back. The first time I noticed something strange was the following day. I arrived at work 15 minutes late, though I'd left the house at the usual time. My commute should have been predictable: bus, train, short walk. But when I checked my phone, 2 hours had vanished. I brushed it off as a glitch or some absent-minded daydreaming, but the incident gnawed at me all morning. I opened my emails, and the timestamp on a message I distinctly remembered writing before leaving for work read 9:47 a.m., a full hour later than it should have been. My co-workers didn't comment on my tardiness, but their glances felt heavier than usual, as if they knew something I didn't. It wasn't just the time lapses. On my walk home that evening, the streetlights buzzed in a discordant rhythm, casting jittery, strobe-like patterns on the pavement. The air felt thicker, dampened, like the pause before a thunderstorm. I passed a coffee shop I didn't recognize, neon sign flickering erratically. "Open late" scrawled across the window. I stopped, staring. I'd walked this route every day for years. This shop hadn't been here yesterday. Inside, a barista waved at me like we were old friends. I waved back, though I didn't know why, and kept walking. The man from the train reappeared 3 days later. He was standing in line at the corner deli as I grabbed a sandwich. Same navy blue coat, same paperback tucked under his arm. He caught my eye and smiled again, that faint twitch of familiarity. I nodded, pretending not to recognize him, and left. But by the time I reached the door, he was already outside, leaning against a lamppost, staring at me. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen him move. I told myself it was coincidence, just a stranger who happened to frequent the same places I did. Yet his presence felt deliberate, like a thread weaving through my life, tighter with every pass. The glitches grew worse. One night, I woke up in my apartment to find every clock blinking 3:17 a.m. I checked my phone, dead, though it had been fully charged before I went to bed. When I turned on the light, the furniture was rearranged. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The couch was facing the wrong direction. A chair was missing. My reflection in the mirror seemed delayed, half a beat slower than it should have been, as though it was considering its movements before mimicking mine. I slept with the lights on. I started seeing the man everywhere. At the grocery store, standing at the bus stop, crossing the street ahead of me. Each time, he looked slightly different. His coat was red instead of navy. His hair was longer or shaved completely. Once, he wore glasses. But it was always him, the same sharp smile, the same assessing gaze. I tried confronting him once, cornering him at the train station. "Do I know you?" I demanded, my voice louder than I'd intended. He tilted his head, amused. "Not yet," he said, and stepped onto the train just as the doors hissed shut. I stood frozen on the platform, watching him vanish into the tunnel. Then the memories started to change. At first, it was small details. A conversation I swore I'd had with a friend, who insisted it never happened. A movie I remembered watching, though I couldn't recall the plot. I'd find objects in my apartment I didn't recognize. A key that fit none of my locks, a book with no title on the spine. My reflection began to look unfamiliar, like a photograph of someone I used to know but couldn't quite place. One afternoon, I visited my parents' house, desperate for grounding. I told them about the glitches, the lapses, the man who kept appearing. They exchanged uneasy glances. My mother took my hand and said, "Sweetheart, you've been living in the city for years. Are you sure you haven't been overworking?" "Years? I moved 6 months ago." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words tangled, slipping from my grasp like sand. My father handed me a cup of tea. "Maybe you should take a break," he said, his voice too calm. I stared at the steaming cup in my hands and realized I didn't remember driving here. The final encounter was at the coffee shop, the one that shouldn't exist. I'd passed it a dozen times, but this time I went inside. The barista was there, as always, smiling like she'd been expecting me. The man was seated at a corner table, his paperback abandoned on the surface, pages fluttering despite the still air. He gestured for me to join him. My legs moved before I could stop them. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He chuckled softly, like I'd asked a naive question. "Think of me as a reminder," he said, his words wrapping around me like fog. "Of what?" I pressed. His smile widened, and for a moment his face shimmered, flickering between versions of himself. The stranger, the barista, my father, my own reflection. "That none of this is real," he said. "Not in the way you think." The world tilted. The coffee shop dissolved around us, replaced by an endless expanse of gray, like the static on an old television screen. I could see fragments of my life flickering in the void. My apartment, the train, my parents' house, all disjointed, out of sequence. The man stood, his form shimmering, and offered me his hand. "You're part of it now," he said. "Welcome." When I woke up, I was sitting on the train, the paperback open in my lap. A man in a navy blue coat smiled at me from across the aisle. I smiled back, though I couldn't remember what. It started with my coffee mug. Not the kind of thing that screams mystery, I know, but it was my favorite one. the one with the faded blue stripes and a chip on the handle that fit my thumb perfectly. I always left it in the same spot, right side of the sink, waiting for its nightly rinse. Except one morning, it wasn't there. I figured I'd just misplaced it, but when I searched the apartment, it was gone. Annoying, sure, but nothing to dwell on. I grabbed another mug, filled it with coffee, and chalked it up to absent-mindedness. By the end of the week, other small things began to vanish. My earbuds, a pen I'd been chewing on while working, the sweater I wore to the grocery store on Wednesday. It just wasn't in my closet anymore. I live alone, so it's not like someone could have taken them. I figured I was overthinking it, or maybe I'd been stressed and not noticing where I put things. Life was a little chaotic after all. Deadlines looming at work, bills stacking up. I could have sworn I was just distracted. Then there was the guy in the elevator. I saw him nearly every morning. Tall, broad-shouldered, carried a gym bag that smelled faintly of sweat and cologne. We never talked beyond the obligatory nod, but on Friday, as the doors closed, he turned to me and said, "Good luck with that report." I froze. It wasn't something a stranger could know about me. But before I could even respond, the doors opened on his floor, and he stepped out like nothing happened. I thought maybe I'd misheard him. Maybe he said something else entirely. I let it go. The weekend passed uneventfully, but Monday brought a strange tension, like a pressure I couldn't name. My coworkers, usually chatty, seemed off. Not unfriendly, just flat. I'd tell a joke and get polite laughter instead of the usual belly laughs. Even the tone of their voices seemed weirdly synchronized, as if they were all following a script. By the time lunch rolled around, I decided to shake it off. Maybe it was just Monday blues, the collective hangover of the work week. That afternoon, I got an email from my boss. Subject line, important. The body of the email was blank. I replied, asking what it was about, but I never got a response. When I checked in with him in person, he stared at me blankly. "I didn't send you an email," he said, a hint of irritation in his voice. His inbox was empty when he showed me. "Maybe you're overworked," he added with a forced chuckle. "You should take a day off." That night, I found my coffee mug. It was sitting on the dining table in plain sight. I'd searched that table a dozen times over the past week, but there it was. Pristine. No chip on the handle, no faded stripes. It looked brand new. I held it in my hands, turning it over, but it felt foreign, like something imitating my mug. I set it back down and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Tuesday was worse. People started calling me by the wrong name. Not once, not twice, but all day. "Hey, Sam," one of my coworkers said as I walked in. "Sam? It's Alex." I corrected, but he just blinked at me, confused. "Right," he muttered and turned back to his screen. By the afternoon, even my boss slipped, asking me to update Sam's spreadsheet. I corrected him too, but he waved me off with a distracted nod. By Wednesday, it wasn't just names. People seemed to forget entire conversations we'd had minutes before. I told my friend Sarah about the email incident, and she laughed it off, saying, "You've always had an active imagination." She said it with such casual confidence that it made me doubt myself. Had I imagined it? That evening, I noticed my apartment felt different. The furniture was exactly where I left it, but the air felt wrong. Heavy, like the weight of a storm that never breaks. That night, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering my name. Not Alex, Sam. It came from the hallway, soft and insistent. I bolted out of bed, heart pounding, and checked the door. Locked. No one was there. I didn't sleep after that. By Thursday, I'd started keeping a journal, jotting down everything strange that happened. It helped, at least for a while, to keep track of reality, or what I thought was reality. I showed it to Sarah after work, desperate for validation, but when she flipped through the pages, she frowned. "It's blank, Alex," she said, holding it up. I snatched it back, and sure enough, every page was empty. My hand started to shake. I swear I'd written in it. I'd filled 10 pages at least. "Maybe you need to talk to someone," she said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder. Friday morning, I didn't recognize my own reflection. It was me, but not me. My face looked sharper, more angular, as if someone had edited my features. My skin was paler. My hair, which I hadn't cut in months, looked freshly trimmed. I reached up to touch it, but the reflection didn't move. It just stared back, its mouth twitching slightly, before breaking into a smile. I stumbled backward, knocking over the mug on the sink. When I turned to look, it wasn't there. Neither was the reflection. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't face the people there, their blank stares and wrong names. Instead, I walked through the city, trying to clear my head. But even the city felt different. Streets didn't lead where they were supposed to. Familiar shops were replaced with ones I didn't recognize. At one point, I swear I passed a mirror in a storefront window, and the person looking back wasn't me. That night, I heard the whispers again. Louder this time. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets, pretending not to hear. Around midnight, the whispers stopped, replaced by silence, so deep it felt like my ears were ringing. When I finally got up, every object in my apartment was slightly off. Angles were wrong, like they didn't quite belong in this reality. My furniture looked just a little too small, or too big, or slightly blurred like a bad photo. Saturday morning, I opened my front door to find a stranger standing there. He was tall and broad-shouldered, carrying a gym bag. "Sam," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's time to go." I slammed the door in his face and locked it, but when I turned around, he was standing in my living room. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone almost apologetic. I don't remember much after that. Just fragments. The mug shattering on the floor. The feeling of weightlessness. A voice, his voice, whispering in my ear, "You'll forget soon enough." When I woke up, everything was back to normal. My name was Alex. My coworkers remembered me. My reflection moved when I did. But every now and then, I catch glimpses of something. Someone watching me from the corner of my eye. And sometimes, when I least expect it, I hear the faintest whisper, "Sam." There was something about the forest in winter that made the world feel both smaller and infinitely vast. It was quiet in a way that pressed against your ears, so thick it seemed to seep into your skin. Snow muffled everything. The crunch of boots, the creak of branches, even the distant hum of life beyond the woods. And in that silence, the mind played tricks, whispering thoughts you wouldn't dare entertain elsewhere. Eric stood on the edge of a frozen lake, his breath clouding in front of him, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He'd come here every winter for the past 5 years, since his father passed, and each time, the ritual felt both comforting and foreign. There was no ceremony, no grave to visit, just this expanse of white and the water below, suspended in time. He hadn't told anyone he was coming out here today. His friends would have insisted on tagging along, joking about how Eric the Hermit couldn't go anywhere without his entourage. But they didn't understand. They never had. Back then, when his dad was alive, the lake was a summer thing, canoeing, fishing, swimming until they were too cold to continue. Winter was for stories by the fireplace, his dad's voice a low rumble as he spun tales that Eric could never quite tell if they were real or imagined. Something about those stories had kept him grounded, even when he was too old to believe in them. Now the lake was something different. It was a boundary, a place where he could scream into the void of the forest and feel like his father might still be listening. His boots slipped slightly on the ice, and he steadied himself. The surface looked solid enough, but Eric had learned long ago never to trust appearances. He hadn't meant to step out so far, just a little past the shore to feel the emptiness stretch around him. But here he was one misstep away from falling through. He chuckled under his breath, the sound swallowed by the stillness. "Dad," he murmured, his voice barely audible even to himself. "You'd probably tell me to get off this damn ice." He shifted his weight back, inching toward the shore, but something caught his eye, movement in the tree line. He froze, squinting against the fading light. It wasn't uncommon to spot deer or the occasional coyote out here, but this felt different. It was too deliberate, too measured. "Hello," he called out, his voice sharper than he intended. No response, just the wind brushing against the treetops. He told himself it was nothing. The mind plays tricks in the cold, after all. Still, his pulse quickened, a dull thud against the walls of his chest. He scanned the trees again, searching for whatever had pulled his attention, but the forest gave nothing away. Eric turned and made his way back to the shore, his pace quickening. By the time he reached solid ground, the sky had turned a bruised purple, stars beginning to prick through the darkness. The woods felt different now, more alive, as if they were watching him. He didn't want to stay any longer than he had to. Pulling his gloves tighter, he turned toward the path that would lead him back to the cabin. His breath fogged in front of him, curling in shapes that dissolved into the cold. He hadn't gone more than a few steps when he heard it, a faint crunch behind him, like a boot on snow. Eric spun around, his breath catching in his throat. Nothing, just the same trees, the same snow, the same frozen lake. But the silence was heavier now, thicker, as if the forest was holding its breath. "Is someone there?" he called, louder this time. No answer. He clenched his fists, willing himself to relax. This was stupid. He was being paranoid. He'd come out here a dozen times before, and nothing had ever happened. Why would today be any different? Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He turned back toward the path and started walking faster, his boots crunching rhythmically against the snow. The cabin wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute walk, but every step felt like an eternity. The trees loomed around him, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The air was colder now, biting through his jacket and stinging his face. Another sound closer this time, a soft, deliberate rustle, like something brushing against the underbrush. Eric stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding. He turned slowly, scanning the woods. The light was almost gone now, the forest swallowed by shadows. "All right," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny." No response. His mind raced through possibilities. An animal? Maybe, but it didn't feel like an animal. Whatever it was watching him. He could feel it. Eric reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. No service, of course. Out here, there never was. But the light gave him a small measure of comfort. He kept walking, his pace quickening, his eyes darting between the trees. The path curved ahead, leading toward the cabin. Almost there, just a few more minutes. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trail. It was barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, unmistakable. Tall, motionless, its outline blurred by the shadows. Eric stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, as if it had been waiting for him. "Who are you?" Eric demanded, his voice cracking. "What do you want?" No answer. Just silence. Eric's pulse thundered in his ears. He took a step back, then another. The figure remained still, its presence looming like a shadow that refused to fade. He didn't wait to find out more. Spinning on his heel, he broke into a run, his boots slipping on the uneven ground. The forest blurred around him, branches clawing at his jacket as he sprinted toward the cabin. He didn't dare look back. He didn't want to know if it was following him. The cabin's porch light came into view, a faint glow cutting through the darkness. Eric's chest burned, his breath ragged as he stumbled up the steps and threw the door open. He slammed it shut behind him, bolting it with trembling hands. Inside, the cabin was quiet, the air thick with the smell of wood and smoke. Eric pressed his back against the door, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely think. He didn't move for a long time, his eyes locked on the window, watching for any sign of movement outside. But the forest was still, the trees swaying gently in the wind. Whatever or whoever had been out there was gone now, or so he told himself. As the hours crept by and the fire in the hearth burned low, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't finished with him yet. And in the silence, he could almost hear his father's voice, whispering a story he hadn't heard before. When it started, I didn't think much of it. It was one of those small annoyances you brush off because life is full of them. A spoon went missing from my kitchen drawer. Not a big deal, right? I live alone, but people misplace things. Maybe I'd thrown it out by mistake, or maybe it fell behind the counter. I let it go. A week later, I noticed my shoes weren't where I'd left them. I always keep them by the front door on the mat, side by side. One morning, I woke up, and they were neatly placed at the bottom of the stairs. Strange, but I had been tired the night before. Maybe I'd moved them and forgotten. Then it became harder to ignore. My keys, which I always hang on a hook by the door, showed up in the bathroom sink. A book I'd been reading disappeared from my nightstand and reappeared days later on the coffee table, open to a page I hadn't reached. I tried to tell myself I was distracted or sleepwalking, but I didn't really believe it. There was a deliberate order to these things. It felt intentional. I mentioned it to my friend Claire, casually over coffee. It's like my apartment has its own poltergeist. I joked, forcing a laugh. She laughed too, but gave me a look like she wasn't sure if I was kidding. Maybe you're just stressed, she offered. Stress can make you forget things, misplace stuff. You're working crazy hours. That explanation was comforting, but it didn't sit right. Stress doesn't explain why a framed photo of my parents ended up face down in the middle of the hallway overnight. I decided to keep track of the incidents, as if cataloging them might give me some insight. I bought a small notebook and wrote down every strange thing I noticed, along with the date and time. February 12th. Living room clock stopped at 3:14 a.m. February 15th. Found 3 of the 5 apples I'd bought rotting in the fridge. February 19th. Hallway light flickering even after I changed the bulb. The note started as a way to reassure myself, to prove that I wasn't losing it. But the more I wrote, the more patterns began to emerge. The disturbances always happened when I was alone. They escalated slowly, almost imperceptibly, but they were definitely escalating. My bathroom mirror fogged up one morning, even though I hadn't used hot water. When I wiped it clean, there were faint streaks on the glass, lines that didn't look random. They seemed deliberate, like someone had dragged their fingers across the surface in a crude spiral. By March, I started feeling watched. It was an absurd feeling, considering I live on the 3rd floor of an old building with no nearby neighbors. But it was persistent. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder or snapping my head toward the window. Sure, I'd seen something move in my peripheral vision. There was never anyone there, just the empty street below or the dimly lit walls of my apartment. One night, I heard it, a soft, deliberate tap, 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 coming from the far corner of the living room. It was so faint that I thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again. I turned on all the lights, heart pounding, but found nothing. The next morning, my notebook was gone. It reappeared 2 days later, lying in the middle of my kitchen table. Every page was blank. I was scared but determined to figure it out. I bought a cheap security camera and set it up in the living room, pointing toward the hallway. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, pressing down on me like a weight. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains. I checked the footage immediately, heart racing. At first, it was nothing but hours of stillness. Then at 3:14 a.m., the same time my clock had stopped weeks earlier, the video glitched. For a few seconds, the screen went black. When it came back, the hallway was empty, but something was different. The picture frame on the wall was crooked. I rewound the footage, trying to see what had moved it, but there was nothing. Just the glitch. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police felt ridiculous. What would I even say? That something invisible was messing with my stuff? I started leaving all the lights on at night, hoping the brightness would keep whatever it was at bay. It didn't help. If anything, the disturbances became more brazen. One evening, I came home to find every cupboard in the kitchen wide open. The contents of my fridge were arranged in a perfect spiral on the floor. I snapped a photo as proof, but when I looked at my phone later, the picture was gone. My gallery was completely empty. I stopped sleeping. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow threatening. I stayed with Claire for a few days, desperate for some relief, but even that didn't help. On the second night, I woke up in her guest room to find the word hello scrawled on the window in what looked like condensation. Claire didn't believe me when I showed her. "It's probably just an old streak from cleaning," she said, but I could tell she thought I was losing it. I returned to my apartment, and everything seemed normal at first. Too normal. It felt like the calm before a storm. That night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate steps pacing back and forth. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and flung open the door, shouting into the darkness. The hallway was empty, but the air felt wrong, thick and heavy, like I was being smothered. I don't know why I looked up, but I did. That's when I saw it. A single handprint on the ceiling, too large to be mine, too far from the walls to make any sense. I froze, unable to move, my brain struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The handprint was smeared, as if whatever had made it had dragged its fingers across the surface before disappearing. I left that night and never went back. I told the landlord I was breaking my lease and moved into a cramped studio on the other side of town. I haven't experienced anything strange since, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night convinced I heard that tap 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 again. The feeling of being watched hasn't completely gone away, and every time I look in the bathroom mirror, I swear I see faint streaks on the glass. Spirals. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not bad, not good, just wrong. It was faint like burnt sugar and damp soil, and it lingered wherever I went. My office, the grocery store, even my car. Nobody else seemed to notice it. When I asked my coworker, Brian, he laughed, said I was probably smelling my own desperation for a vacation. I laughed too, but the sound felt forced, like someone else's voice coming out of my mouth. The next thing was my phone. It started small, notifications I didn't remember clearing, apps I didn't remember installing. One night, I unlocked it to find my gallery filled with hundreds of pictures. They were all of me. Not selfies, no, these were candid shots. Me sitting at my desk, brushing my teeth, walking into my building. They were taken from strange angles, some high above, some low to the ground. I deleted them all, heart hammering, but the unease stuck to me like tar. I tried telling myself it was some sort of malware, but when I mentioned it to Brian, he just gave me a blank look. "You don't even have a gallery app," he said. I showed him my phone, but the gallery was gone. He smirked, shrugged, and said, "Guess you're imagining things." The smell got stronger after that. It seemed to seep into my skin, my clothes, my sheets. It followed me everywhere, thick and cloying, and I began scrubbing myself raw in the shower just to get away from it. No one else could smell it, of course. People stopped sitting next to me on the subway, though. They glance at me and then quickly look away, their expressions unreadable. I started taking cabs instead, but even the drivers seemed tense, glancing at me through the rearview mirror like I'd done something wrong. The real trouble started with the dog. My neighbor, Mrs. Carter, had a scruffy little terrier named Max. I'd known him for years. He barked at me every time I passed her apartment door. One night, I was coming home late and Max was sitting in the hallway. He didn't bark. He didn't even growl. He just stared at me, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, his eyes glinting in the dim light. I slowed as I passed him, heart racing, and he opened his mouth. His lips moved. "Smells wrong," he said. The words were garbled, wet like someone struggling to speak through a mouthful of water. I ran inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself I was overtired, stressed, hallucinating. But when I lay in bed that night, I heard scratching at the door. Soft, persistent, and then faintly Max's voice again. "Smells wrong." I didn't sleep. The next morning, Mrs. Carter was gone. Her apartment was empty, cleared out overnight. The building manager didn't even seem to remember her. "What lady?" he said, frowning at me like I was crazy. I didn't push it. I couldn't stop thinking about Max, though, his warped voice. Things escalated quickly after that. People at work stopped talking to me altogether. They glanced at me out of the corners of their eyes, whispering to each other when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Even Brian, who'd always been a loud, sarcastic presence in the office, grew quiet around me. One day, he leaned over my desk and whispered, "I don't know what you did, but you should leave. They don't like it." "Who?" I asked, but he just shook his head and walked away. I didn't see him after that. His desk was cleared out the next morning, and when I asked where he'd gone, my boss said, "Who's Brian?" I started noticing other changes, too. The street outside my building looked narrower somehow. The buildings on either side leaned in just slightly, like they were crowding me. Familiar faces disappeared, replaced by strangers who smiled too widely, their teeth faintly yellow. My apartment door stopped creaking when I opened it, even though it always had before. One morning, my coffee tasted like salt. Another, my toothpaste smelled like gasoline. And then there were the mirrors. It was subtle at first. My reflection moved a split second too late, or blinked when I didn't. But one night, as I brushed my teeth, it smiled. A wide, slow grin that spread across its face like melting wax. I stumbled back, dropping my toothbrush, and the reflection tilted its head at me, almost curious. When I looked again, it was normal. I avoided mirrors after that. I tried leaving. I packed a bag and drove out of the city, but no matter how far I went, the same buildings, the same streets looped back around. I'd turn a corner and find myself back on my block. The gas station near the freeway had a clerk who looked at me like he knew something I didn't. When I asked for directions, he handed me a map with a single word scrawled across it in red ink: stay. I didn't stop driving until the tank was empty. When I finally pulled over, I was on my street again. My apartment was waiting for me, the lights already on. That night, I dreamed of a dark, empty room filled with the scent of burnt sugar and damp soil. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear voices all around me, whispering, laughing, repeating the same phrase over and over. Smells wrong. When I woke up, the smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I opened my window for fresh air, but the street outside was silent. Too silent. No cars, no footsteps, no barking dogs. Just stillness. When I looked closer, I realized the people weren't moving. They stood frozen in mid-step, their heads all turned toward my apartment, their faces blank. Watching. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know if I'm going insane, or if the world around me is breaking apart. But the smell won't go away, and the whispers are getting louder. Every time I close my eyes, I hear them. Smells wrong. And now, when I look in the mirror, my reflection doesn't move at all. It just stands there, watching me, its grin growing wider. It started on an unremarkable Tuesday. I was at a cafe near my office, nursing a latte that had gone lukewarm while I scrolled through my phone. The cafe was busy, the low hum of conversations and clinking cups providing a comforting backdrop. I glanced up from my screen and caught the eye of a man sitting across the room. He was nondescript, average height, dark hair, wearing a faded green hoodie. Nothing about him screamed memorable, but he gave me a small, polite smile, the kind you exchange with strangers when your eyes meet by accident. I returned it out of reflex and went back to my phone. The next day I saw him again, this time at the grocery store. It didn't register at first. I was scanning the shelves for my favorite pasta sauce when I noticed someone standing a little too close. I turned, and there he was, the same man from the cafe. He was holding a basket filled with random items: bananas, a carton of milk, and a single onion. I offered a tight smile and stepped away, chalking it up to coincidence. People live in neighborhoods. They run into each other. It's normal, right? But then I saw him again, and again. First at the park where I jog on weekends, sitting on a bench with a book. Then outside the library near my apartment, loitering with a coffee cup in hand. Every time, it was subtle enough not to raise alarms, but his presence was becoming a constant. He wasn't doing anything overtly creepy. He didn't approach me or try to talk, but he always made sure to be where I could see him, his gaze following me for just a moment too long. By the fifth or sixth encounter, my discomfort had grown into a quiet panic. I told myself it was paranoia. Cities are big, sure, but routines overlap. People frequent the same places. It wasn't like he was showing up in my living room, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started to notice small details. The way he always seemed to be dressed for the occasion, like he knew where I would be. At the park, he wore joggers and running shoes. At the library, a casual sweater and jeans. It was subtle, but it felt intentional, like he was blending in. One night, I was walking home from dinner with a friend. The air was crisp, and the streets were quieter than usual. I turned the corner to my street and froze. There he was, standing under the flickering glow of a street lamp. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking down at his phone. My stomach dropped. I debated turning around, but it would have been obvious. Instead, I forced myself to walk past him. My keys were clutched so tightly in my hand that the metal bit into my palm. He didn't say anything as I walked by, but I could feel his eyes on me. When I finally reached my apartment door and turned to look back, he was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being ridiculous. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I started altering my routines. I stopped going to my usual cafe. I picked a different grocery store. I avoided the park altogether. But no matter where I went, he was there, always just close enough to be noticed, but far enough to feign coincidence. It was maddening. I started seeing his face in my sleep, waking up in cold sweats from dreams where he was standing at the foot of my bed, silent and watching. One evening, I worked late at the office. The cleaning staff had already left, and the building was eerily quiet. I gathered my things and stepped into the elevator, grateful to finally be heading home. The doors were closing when a hand shot between them, triggering the sensor. My heart leapt into my throat as the doors reopened. It was him. He stepped into the elevator, nodding politely as if we were strangers. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I couldn't bring myself to look at him directly. He pressed a button for the third floor and stood silently as the elevator began its descent. My stop was the lobby, but I stepped off on the third floor the moment the doors opened, muttering something about forgetting my phone. I didn't wait to see if he followed. I sprinted down the hall to the stairs and didn't stop until I was outside, gulping down the cool night air. After that, I stopped sleeping well. Every noise in my apartment felt amplified. A creak in the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, the faint rustle of the wind against my windows. I started double-checking my locks and leaving a chair wedged under the doorknob at night. I told a few friends about the man, but they all said the same thing. You're overthinking it. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that I was just being dramatic, that this was some bizarre string of coincidences. But then I found the note. It was tucked into my mailbox one morning, a plain envelope with my name scrawled on the front. Inside was a single piece of paper with 2 words written in neat, deliberate handwriting. You're interesting. No name. No explanación. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my hands trembling. It was the first tangible proof that this wasn't just in my head. Someone was watching me. Someone was following me. And now they wanted me to know it. I went to the police, but they weren't much help. Do you know his name? They asked. Has he threatened you? No, I didn't know his name. And no, he hadn't threatened me. Not yet. They told me to keep an eye out and report anything suspicious, which felt laughably inadequate. What could they do with no evidence and no identity to go on? That night, I couldn't stay in my apartment. I checked into a hotel across town, paying in cash and using a fake name. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, waiting for the knock on the door that never came. The next morning, I left the hotel and walked aimlessly through the city, hoping the movement would clear my head. I ducked into a quiet coffee shop and sat by the window, watching strangers pass by on the sidewalk. And then I saw him, standing across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost. Our eyes met through the glass, and he smiled, polite, unassuming, the same smile he'd given me that first day in the cafe. I felt my stomach churn as he raised a hand in a small wave. I don't know how he found me. I don't know if I'm imagining half of this, or if I'm part of some twisted game. All I know is that no matter where I go, he's there, watching, waiting. And the worst part? I still don't even know his name. I always left it on the counter by the sink, never in the cupboard because I liked it ready for my groggy mornings. One Tuesday it was gone. I searched everywhere. The cupboard, the dishwasher, the living room where it had no reason to be. Frustrated, I pulled out a backup mug and went about my day. The next morning, my regular mug was right there on the counter again, in its usual spot, as though nothing had happened. I brushed it off, convincing myself I must have overlooked it, even though that explanation didn't sit right. Then came the keys. I left them on the hook by the door, as always. Later, when I reached for them, they weren't there. After tearing apart my apartment, I found them inexplicably wedged in the couch cushions. How? I lived alone, and no one else had access to my place. The thought of someone breaking in just to move my stuff around was too absurd, so I told myself I must have absent-mindedly carried them there. A plausible excuse, sure, but it didn't quite quell the growing itch in the back of my mind. These moments started to multiply, small things at first. A book I'd been reading would vanish from my nightstand and reappear in the bathroom. The TV remote would migrate from the coffee table to the fridge. Once, I found my laundry folded and put away neatly in the drawers, even though I distinctly remembered leaving the damp clothes in the washer before heading to bed. The strangest part? I wasn't scared. Not yet. Just curious. It was like being the protagonist of some mildly irritating scavenger hunt. The first time I saw her, I thought I was imagining things. A woman in a bright yellow coat standing at the corner of Main Street, staring at me. She had this blank look, like she wasn't entirely there. When I glanced back a moment later, she was gone. Odd, but not alarming. A week later, I saw her again. Same coat, same expression, but this time in the grocery store. She stood perfectly still in the bread aisle, blocking my path. I maneuvered around her, muttering an apology. When I glanced back, she was gone again. After the third or fourth time, I started paying attention. She never spoke, never moved much, but she was always staring at me. Always in yellow. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence or maybe an overactive imagination. But then I began noticing other repetitions. The same guy jogging past my building at exactly 7:12 a.m. every morning. The barista at the cafe down the street handed me my drink before I even ordered, even though I rarely went there. The same car, a green sedan, parked in my spot at work, no matter how early or late I arrived. These weren't just routines. They were patterns, endlessly looping around me, tightening like a noose. The glitches grew bolder. One night, I walked into my apartment to find my furniture completely rearranged. My couch was pushed against the opposite wall. My dining table had swapped places with my bookshelf. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to piece together some rational explanation. When I woke up the next morning, everything was back to normal, like the universe had quietly reset itself overnight. Another time, I stepped into my bedroom and found it painted a deep red. The walls, the ceiling, even my bedspread. I blinked, staggered back out, and returned to find everything perfectly ordinary again. My brain couldn't keep up anymore. It was as though reality was misfiring, and I was just a spectator to the fallout. Over time, I stopped reacting. Why bother? I learned to accept the absurdity, even when it escalated. The woman in yellow started showing up in my apartment, standing silently in the corner of my bedroom or perched on my living room chair. I tried speaking to her once, but she just tilted her head, unblinking. She wasn't threatening. She was just there, like a misplaced puzzle piece that didn't belong in the picture, but refused to be removed. The sense of déjà vu became overwhelming. I'd walk into my office and swear I'd already lived the day before. Conversations felt recycled, like I was an actor in a play endlessly rehashing the same lines. People would tell me things I already knew, and sometimes I'd answer questions before they were asked without meaning to. The loops tightened further. My days folded in on themselves like a Mobius strip, and I stopped trying to differentiate between what was real and what wasn't. It all blended into the same static haze. The final break came on a Sunday. I woke up and the world was off. The sky outside my window was a shade of green I'd never seen before, a sickly, pulsating hue that felt alive. My phone refused to turn on, and my clocks were frozen at 4:17 a.m. The air tasted metallic, and every sound seemed muffled, as though I were trapped underwater. I stepped outside and found the streets completely empty, not just devoid of people. There were no cars, no birds, no wind. Nothing moved. Nothing existed except for me and the endless, suffocating stillness. When I turned back to my apartment, the woman in yellow was standing in the doorway. For the first time, she smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. It was knowing, as if she had been waiting for this moment. And then she stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. I hesitated but found myself walking forward, my legs moving on their own. Inside, the walls shimmered like static on a broken TV screen. My belongings were gone, replaced with endless reflections of myself, each one staring back with the same blank expression. I tried to speak, but my voice came out garbled, distorted. It didn't matter. Somehow, I knew the truth. This wasn't my world anymore. Maybe it never had been. I'm not sure how long I've been here. Time doesn't work the way it used to. The patterns are all that remain now. The same faces, the same moments, endlessly recycled. I'm part of it too. A glitch, an anomaly trapped in a system I'll never fully understand. Sometimes I see someone new, someone who doesn't quite belong, and I watch them notice the cracks for the first time. I smile at them, waiting, knowing it's only a matter of time before they join me. The train station was alive with motion, but time had frozen for Lucien. He stood on the platform, his hand gripping a black leather briefcase, so tightly the veins in his hand throbbed. Around him, travelers bustled, hustling to catch trains, dragging suitcases, chatting into phones. It was a mundane Thursday evening for everyone but Lucien. For him, it was the beginning of the end. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not at this station, not at this time. He was supposed to be in a conference room 3 hours away, presenting a meticulously rehearsed pitch to the board. But a call had come that morning, unexpected and cryptic. A voice that felt like a memory said only Platform 6, 7 p.m. You owe me. Then the line went dead. Lucien hadn't recognized the voice, but the weight of the words pulled him here, and now he waited. Trains hissed as they arrived and departed, and the growing cold of the November evening settled into his bones. He glanced at the station clock, 7:03. The impatient rhythm of his heartbeat matched the clicking of a woman's heels as she passed. Then he saw her. She wore a long coat, its lapels sharp as a blade, and a red scarf that whipped in the wind as if alive. She moved with the kind of confidence that either unnerved or hypnotized everyone she passed. As her eyes met his, Lucien felt both. Her smile was faint but familiar. She stepped close enough that he caught a scent of winter and something faintly floral, like pressed roses in an old book. You haven't changed much, she said. Her voice was low, smooth, and carried a hint of an accent he couldn't place. Do I know you? Lucien asked, though the words felt foolish as they left his mouth. Not anymore, she replied, tilting her head. But you knew me once. There was no time to unravel the mystery. She gestured to a train that had just pulled into the station. It's leaving soon. If you want answers, you'll come. Without waiting, she turned and boarded. Lucien hesitated for a beat too long. As the train's departure whistle cut through the station, he lunged for the doors, stepping into a carriage that felt oddly out of place. The lighting was dim and warm, casting a golden glow over lush seats upholstered in deep crimson. It felt less like a modern commuter train and more like something pulled from a dream or a forgotten era. She was seated near the back, a cup of tea already steaming on the table in front of her. The contrast of her calmness against his jittery energy made him feel as though he'd walked into a trap. Sit, she said, her voice a command cloaked in civility. Lucien lowered himself into the seat opposite hers, the leather sighing beneath his weight. Who are you? He demanded. You don't remember me, and that's by design. She stirred her tea thoughtfully, not looking at him. But I remember you. I remember everything. I don't understand. No, she said with a soft chuckle. You don't. But let me remind you of something simple. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp as glass. 2 years ago, in a cafe on Rue Vintner, you left a briefcase behind. Inside was something precious, something you didn't mean for anyone else to find. Lucien's throat tightened. He did remember that day vividly. He'd been careless, distracted, and reckless. The briefcase had been retrieved, and he'd assumed the incident was closed. How do you know about that? Because I'm the one who found it, she said. And what I found inside, her voice trailed off, but her gaze stayed fixed on him. A cold wave of realization swept over Lucien. You're blackmailing me? She laughed, genuinely amused. If I wanted money, I'd already have it. This isn't about blackmail. It's about debt. You owe me for what I didn't do with that knowledge. What do you want? Her smile faded. Something's coming. Something you helped build, whether you intended to or not. A system designed to control, to erase, to replace humanity with an algorithm. You know what I mean? He did. He'd been part of the project since its inception. A machine learning platform capable of analyzing human behavior on a granular level, predicting actions, and shaping decisions. It's not meant to harm anyone, he said defensively. It's just data. It's never just data, she snapped. You've given the keys to people who don't care about consequences. Do you think they'll stop at shaping markets or elections? They'll shape lives. They'll rewrite choices before they're even made. And when the harm comes, it won't be theirs to answer for. It'll be yours. Lucien looked away, the golden light of the train suddenly oppressive. "What do you expect me to do? It's too big to stop." "You're right," she said. "It is, but systems are only as strong as their weakest point." She reached in her coat and pulled out a slim USB drive. "This is your way out." He stared at it, suspicion mingling with curiosity. "What's on it?" "The proof that destroys the system from within. A worm that unravels the code, makes it irreparable. They'll try to rebuild, but by the time they do, people will have seen too much. There'll be no trust left." Lucien's mind raced. The train swayed gently, a lullaby of motion against the storm of his thoughts. "If I do this," he said, "they'll know it was me." "Of course," she said with a faint smile. "But what's the alternative? Letting it run its course until there's nothing left of free will." He hesitated. The weight of the USB in his hand was unbearable. "And you? Why do you care?" She rose, her scarf trailing behind her like the ghost of an answer. "Let's just say I had my choices stolen once. I won't let it happen again." As the train slowed to its next stop, she paused in the doorway. "This is your stop too, Lucien. The rest is up to you." He sat frozen as the train hissed and the doors opened. By the time he stepped onto the platform, she was gone. Above him, the city loomed, a maze of glass and steel, its lights shimmering like 1,000 tiny eyes watching his every move. In his pocket, the USB felt heavier than any briefcase he'd ever carried. The first time I lost time, I chalked it up to exhaustion. A stressful week at work and late nights binge-watching a series everyone kept telling me to watch. I figured it was a cocktail for sleep deprivation. One minute I was sipping coffee on the couch, half listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and the next I was standing in my kitchen, the coffee mug shattered on the floor. My heart pounded as I stared down at the ceramic shards. There was coffee dripping from my hand. Had I spilled it on myself? But no, my clothes were dry. I bent down to pick up a piece, wincing when the edge cut my palm. The sting brought clarity, and I shook my head like I was trying to dislodge the fog in my brain. Maybe I'd zoned out, or fallen asleep standing up. People do that, don't they? I cleaned up the mess and didn't think much of it until the second time it happened. This time it was more than just a couple of minutes. It was Tuesday afternoon. I remember because I had a meeting scheduled with my boss about a project deadline. I was sitting at my desk, checking my emails, when the fluorescent lights above me seemed to flicker. I blinked up at them, and when I looked back down, my inbox was empty. Not cleared out empty, just gone. Every single email vanished. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but before I could figure out what was happening, my phone buzzed. It was a reminder for the meeting. I grabbed my notebook and headed toward the conference room, but the hallway seemed too quiet. The air felt heavier, like the atmosphere after a thunderstorm. I pushed the door open, and my boss looked up, startled. He was mid-sentence, speaking to someone who wasn't there. "You're early," he said, his tone accusatory. I glanced at the clock on the wall and froze. The meeting wasn't for another 2 hours. I apologized, embarrassed, and backed out of the room. But as I walked away, I heard him mutter something to himself. It sounded like, "Why does she keep doing this?" That night, I couldn't sleep. My brain replayed the scene in the office, the empty emails, the flickering lights. I didn't feel like myself. It was as if my thoughts were wearing clothes that didn't fit right, something slightly off but impossible to pinpoint. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other things. Small things. At first, I'd put my keys down on the counter, but the next morning, they'd be in my bedroom. I'd buy groceries and come home to find items I didn't remember picking up, brands I didn't even like. The people around me seemed off too. My coworker Emily, who always greeted me with a cheery "morning, sunshine," barely acknowledged me one day. Her face was pale, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. When I asked if everything was okay, she frowned and said, "We talked about this yesterday. Don't pretend you don't remember." I didn't remember. The days started blurring together, like watercolors bleeding into one another. I woke up one morning in clothes I didn't recognize, the taste of salt on my tongue. My alarm clock said 7:34 a.m., but my phone said 5:16 p.m. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the nightstand, even though I hadn't eaten all day. I started keeping a journal, hoping to track the gaps in my memory, But every time I went back to reread my entries, they were blank. The breaking point came when I found the pictures. It was a Friday night, and I was scrolling through my phone trying to find a photo I'd taken of my cat a few days earlier. Instead, I found a series of images I didn't recognize. They were all of me, sitting at my desk, brushing my teeth, even sleeping. My face looked vacant in the pictures, my eyes unfocused. One of the photos was of me sitting in my car, staring at the camera like I knew someone was taking the picture. But the timestamp on the photo said 3:17 a.m. I didn't even remember being in my car at that time. I tried to tell myself it was a prank. Someone had gotten into my phone, or maybe I'd been hacked. I wanted to believe that, but deep down I knew it wasn't true. The photos felt too personal, too close. Like someone or something was documenting my life from the inside. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment. I even pushed my dresser against the bedroom door for good measure. I lay awake for hours, clutching a flashlight like it would do me any good. Around 2 a.m., I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the dresser was back where it belonged, and my bedroom door was wide open. I felt sick. My skin crawled as I sat up and looked around the room. That's when I noticed the mirror on the far wall. Something was wrong with it. My reflection wasn't moving. I blinked, but the version of me in the mirror didn't. It just stared, its mouth slightly open like it was about to speak. Then it smiled. Not a warm smile, but something cold and sharp, like it knew something I didn't. I screamed and threw the flashlight at the mirror. The glass shattered, shards scattering across the floor, but when I looked down, there was no broken glass. The mirror was whole, and my reflection was gone. I don't know how to explain what's happening to me. I tried telling my friends, but they look at me with pity, like I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. I've stopped keeping track of time because it doesn't seem to matter anymore. Days slip through my fingers like sand, and I'm not sure which memories are real and which ones are planted. The last thing I wrote in my journal before the pages started disappearing was this: "Whoever is reading this, I need you to know I'm still in here. I don't know how much longer I'll be myself, but if I stop recognizing you, it's not me. Please don't trust me." Now, sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see that smile again. I'm starting to feel it too. That cold, sharp pull at the corners of my mouth. It's getting harder to fight it, harder to tell where I end and it begins. I first noticed it when I came home from work one Thursday. It was an ordinary day, the kind that slips by like sand through your fingers. I dropped my bag by the door, kicked off my shoes, and reached for the remote. My favorite mug was sitting on the coffee table, just where I left it that morning. A slight ring of coffee stains circled the bottom, and a small chip on the handle caught the light. The chipped handle was familiar, a relic of a clumsy moment years ago. Everything was exactly how it should have been. A few hours later, I got up to make dinner. The usual, some spaghetti and sauce from a jar. Nothing ambitious. As I waited for the water to boil, I glanced back toward the living room, and my stomach sank. The mug was still there. It wasn't just there, it was exactly there, in the exact same position, down to the way the handle was pointing like a compass needle. I hadn't touched it, but something about the way it sat felt wrong. I shrugged it off and chalked it up to an overactive imagination. The next day I woke up and did my morning routine. Shower, coffee, breakfast, out the door. On my walk to the bus stop, I noticed a familiar blue sedan parked across the street. It was an older model, a little rusty around the edges, with a bumper sticker that read, "Keep calm and let me drive." The kind of thing you barely notice. But then, at lunch, I saw the same car parked outside the cafe. Same sticker, same rust. That was odd enough, but when I got home that evening, the sedan was parked 2 doors down from my apartment. 3 times in one day. I couldn't shake the feeling it was following me. I didn't sleep much that night. My dreams were tangled loops of déjà vu and half-remembered conversations. I woke up with the unsettling sense that my own life was a series of replays, stitched together like a badly edited movie. On Saturday, I decided to clear my head with a walk around the neighborhood. I needed fresh air, movement, anything to snap out of the weird fog I'd been living in. I passed by a park, and that's when I saw her, a woman in a bright red jacket with a fluffy white scarf. She was walking a tiny, yipping dog that looked like it might weigh 5 pounds tops. She smiled as she walked past me. An hour later, I looped back toward my apartment. That's when I saw her again. Same woman, same dog, same red jacket, and white scarf. But this time, she wasn't walking toward me. She was coming from the opposite direction, as if she'd somehow circled the block the wrong way. Her smile froze me in place, like she was waiting for me to notice. I didn't know whether to say something or just keep walking, so I turned back toward my building and went inside, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Cities are weird like that, right? By Monday, the feeling of being stuck in a loop had grown unbearable. I glanced at my desk at work, only to notice the same pen I'd picked up and dropped 20 minutes earlier was still sitting at the exact same angle. My boss wore the same tie 3 days in a row, which he never did. Even the office coffee machine seemed to pour coffee at the exact same speed, with the same splashes every single time I used it. The more I noticed, the worse it got. Tiny details repeated themselves endlessly, like the world had forgotten how to improvise. The breaking point came that evening when I got off the bus and walked home. As I turned the corner to my street, I saw a man in a green hoodie crouched by the curb, tying his shoe. He had scruffy brown hair and wore earbuds, nodding along to whatever he was listening to. I thought nothing of it, until I passed the same man again 2 blocks later, crouched in the exact same position. The shoelace was still untied. His earbuds were still in, the same song still playing faintly. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Hey," I said, half yelling to get his attention. He didn't react. He didn't even flinch. I took a step closer. "Are you okay?" Still nothing. It was like he was on a loop, frozen in that exact moment. My heart raced as I backed away and hurried home. Something was deeply wrong. When I stepped into my apartment, I froze. The mug was on the coffee table again, handle pointing the same way, the coffee stained an unbroken ring. My breathing turned shallow as I backed out of the room, leaving the door ajar behind me. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper, like it had been drained of its usual hum of life. The streetlights buzzed faintly, flickering like they were trying to tell me something. That night, I decided to test it. I moved the mug to the kitchen counter, deliberately spilling a few drops of water inside it. Then I grabbed a notebook and started writing everything down. The car, the woman with the dog, the man tying his shoe. I wrote until my hand cramped, trying to map out the patterns, the repetitions. When I woke up the next morning, the notebook was gone. The mug was back on the coffee table. The water inside it had disappeared, but the coffee stain remained. My mind reeled. I started seeing the repetitions everywhere after that. People I passed on the street would appear again a few blocks later, wearing the same clothes, carrying the same bags. The sound of birdsong outside my window repeated every hour, a perfect copy of itself. The same arguments played out on the radio, word for word, every time I turned it on. My life had become a closed circuit, a feedback loop I couldn't escape. One night, I stood in my living room, staring at the mug, the TV, the walls. I felt like a lab rat in some cosmic experiment, running through the same maze over and over again. My pulse pounded in my ears as I screamed into the empty room. Who's doing this? What is this? For the first time in days, something different happened. The lights flickered, and the TV turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, then resolved into a single line of text. "You're not supposed to notice." The screen went dark. I stood there, trembling, as the reality of it sank in. I wasn't just living in a loop. I was part of a system, something designed to feel real but riddled with flaws. Whoever or whatever was in charge hadn't accounted for me noticing. I thought about smashing the mug, throwing it against the wall to see if it would reset. But as I reached for it, I stopped. Would it even matter? If this world was fake, breaking a mug wouldn't change a thing. The loop might start over. Or worse, it might end. What would be left if the system broke? I sat down and stared at the mug for hours, paralyzed by the question. Was it better to live in a fake world or risk the unknown? The answer, if there even was one, stayed just out of reach, mocking me in silence. It all started the day I moved into my new apartment. It wasn't a luxury place, but it was clean, in a decent neighborhood, and most importantly, it was mine. After years of roommates and cramped living conditions, I was finally on my own. I spent the entire weekend unpacking, reveling in the silence and freedom. On Sunday afternoon, While struggling to assemble an IKEA bookshelf, I heard a knock at my door. Standing there was a man in his late 30s or early 40s, holding a small plate of cookies. He introduced himself as Mark, my neighbor from the unit directly across the hall. He had a friendly smile, the kind that made the deep lines around his eyes crinkle, and he seemed genuinely nice. "Thought I'd welcome you to the building," he said, holding out the cookies. I thanked him and made a little small talk about the area and how I liked the apartment so far. He didn't linger long, just long enough to let me know he lived alone and worked nights as a security guard. The first couple of weeks passed without much incident. I'd see Mark occasionally in the hallway or the parking lot, and we'd exchange brief pleasantries. He seemed quiet, maybe a little lonely, but never anything more than polite. One night, I came home late from work, juggling groceries in my bag. As I struggled to find my keys, Mark appeared out of nowhere and offered to help. "You're always carrying so much stuff," he said with a laugh as he grabbed a few bags. "I don't mind lending a hand." I was grateful and thanked him as we entered my apartment. He didn't step inside, just handed me the bags and lingered in the doorway. That's when he asked, "Do you live here alone?" Something about the question made me pause. It felt a little too direct, but I brushed it off as harmless curiosity and answered vaguely, "Yeah, for now." He smiled, nodded, and said, "Well, if you ever need anything, I'm right across the hall." Then he left. After that, I started noticing him more. He always seemed to be around, whether I was leaving for work, coming home, or even just checking my mail. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. We lived on the same floor, after all, but there was an odd pattern to it. One time, I went to the laundry room in the basement, and just as I was loading my clothes into the machine, Mark showed up. "Hey there," he said casually, holding a single shirt in his hand. "Who goes to the laundry room with one shirt?" I smiled politely and focused on my laundry, but he kept talking, asking about my job, my family, whether I liked living here. His questions weren't intrusive on the surface, but they piled up quickly, like he was cataloging information. The next week, I came home to find a small bouquet of flowers outside my door. There was no note, but I had a sinking feeling they were from Mark. That evening, I knocked on his door to ask. He opened it immediately, like he'd been standing just behind it. "Oh yeah," he said, smiling sheepishly. "I thought you might like them. Just a little something to brighten your day." I thanked him awkwardly and told him it wasn't necessary, hoping to set some boundaries. His smile faltered for a split second before returning. "Of course," he said, "but, it's nice to feel appreciated once in a while." After that, things escalated. I'd hear strange noises in the hallway at night. Soft footsteps that stopped just outside my door, the faint sound of breathing. One night, I got a text from an unknown number. "Saw you come home late tonight. Be careful out there." My stomach dropped. I asked who it was, but there was no reply. The next morning, I found Mark waiting by the mailboxes. "You okay?" he asked. "You looked upset last night." That's when it hit me. He was watching me. I tried to play it cool, muttering something about being tired, but my hands were shaking. For the first time, I noticed how close he stood, how his eyes lingered on my face a little too long. I started taking precautions, double-checking my locks, keeping my blinds closed, and avoiding him as much as possible. But avoiding him wasn't easy. He always seemed to know when I was home. Once, I pretended to be on a phone call as I walked past his door, hoping to avoid conversation. Seconds later, I heard his door open behind me. "Everything okay?" he called out. I didn't turn around, just waved and kept walking. That night, there was a knock at my door around 10 p.m. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. "It's Mark," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you're okay." I thought I heard something. I didn't answer. Eventually, he went away, but I barely slept that night. The final straw came a few days later. I was at home, getting ready for bed, when I heard the distinct sound of my doorknob rattling. My heart stopped. Someone was trying to open my door. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the dispatcher about what was happening. The rattling stopped, but I stayed on the line until the police arrived. When they did, there was no sign of anyone in the hallway. They checked the building's security cameras, but the footage conveniently didn't cover my floor. The officers were kind, but dismissive, suggesting it might have been a prank or a misunderstanding. As they left, I saw Mark standing in his doorway, watching silently. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes chilled me to the bone. I moved out 2 weeks later, breaking my lease and losing my deposit. Some might say I overreacted, that Mark was just an awkward but harmless neighbor. But every time I think about those footsteps outside my door, or the way his questions felt like traps, my gut tells me otherwise. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. Maybe nothing. Or maybe I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Mark, if you're reading this, let's not meet again. It began with the smell. When I first moved into the duplex, I thought the faint metallic tang in the air was leftover cleaning products or maybe old pipes. The landlord assured me everything had been renovated. New paint, new carpet, even new fixtures in the bathroom. The smell wasn't strong, just enough to tickle the edge of my senses, so I ignored it. A small price to pay for cheap rent in a decent neighborhood. I met my neighbor a few days after moving in. She was a wiry woman in her late 50s, with sharp blue eyes and hair dyed the color of copper. Her name was Ms. Yarrow, and she introduced herself with a wide, toothy smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had a peculiar way of pausing mid-sentence, like she was carefully choosing her words, or waiting for a cue I couldn't hear. "Welcome to the building," she said, holding out a plate of cookies that smelled faintly burnt. "It's nice to have someone new." The last tenant, well, she didn't stay long. "Oh?" I asked, taking the cookies out of politeness. Ms. Yarrow's smile flickered. She just wasn't suited for the place. "You seem different, though. Sturdier." The comment stuck with me, but I laughed it off and thanked her. That night, as I was unpacking, the metallic smell intensified. Sharper now, almost bitter. I checked the pipes, sniffed around the vents, even stuck my head out the window to see if there was something outside. Nothing. The smell wasn't the only strange thing. My duplex was old, and the walls weren't thick. I'd hear the usual noises from Ms. Yarrow's side. TV chatter, footsteps, the occasional clink of dishes. But there were other sounds, too. At night, long after she should have been asleep, I'd hear what sounded like furniture scraping across the floor, back and forth in the same pattern. And once, just before dawn, a low humming, almost like someone tuning a radio. I told myself it was nothing. I wanted this place to work. I wanted to believe I wasn't being paranoid. About a week later, Ms. Yarrow invited me over for tea. Her side of the duplex was identical to mine, but something about it felt different. The air was heavy, and everything was just a little too neat. No clutter, no dust, not a single scuff on the walls. It felt like a set, not a home. She served tea in mismatched cups and watched me drink with that same toothy smile. Her questions were polite but prying. Did I live alone? Did I have family nearby? Did I like my job? She seemed especially interested in whether I had people who might visit often. I answered vaguely, feeling more and more uncomfortable as the minutes ticked by. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "Have you met it yet?" I froze mid-sip. "Met what?" "The thing in the walls." She leaned back in her chair, her eyes gleaming. "I don't mean to scare you, dear. It's harmless mostly. Just curious." I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking, but her face didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, you will," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "It always makes itself known eventually. You'll be fine, as long as you don't go looking for it." I left shortly after, feeling rattled but unsure why. I told myself she was just eccentric, maybe lonely, and that her strange comments were a harmless quirk. But that night, the sounds from the walls were louder than ever. The scraping was faster now, frantic, and there was a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against the plaster. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. Not from outside, but from inside. The feeling was so strong that I finally got up and inspected every inch of my apartment. I checked the closets, under the bed, behind the furniture. Nothing. Still, the feeling persisted, prickling at the back of my neck. The next morning, I found a smear of rust-colored residue on the wall near the corner of my living room. It wasn't there before. It looked almost like blood, but drier, darker. I scrubbed it off, telling myself it was just old paint seeping through. The smell got worse. Metallic and sour now, so strong it made my stomach turn. I called the landlord, who said he'd send someone to check the pipes. But when the plumber arrived, he looked puzzled. "There's nothing wrong," he said. "Everything's clean as a whistle." That night, I woke up to the sound of something moving under the floorboards. Not rats or mice, this was bigger, heavier. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and stared at the floor, waiting for the noise to stop. It didn't. It traveled, slow and deliberate, from one side of the room to the other. I didn't go back to sleep. The next morning, Ms. Yarrow was waiting for me outside my door. Her eyes were brighter than usual, almost feverish. "It likes you," she said. "What?" I asked, too exhausted to hide my irritation. "The thing," she said, her voice almost gleeful. "It doesn't usually take to people so quickly. You must have something special." I didn't respond. I just brushed past her and left for work. When I got home that evening, there was a new stain on the wall, this time in the shape of a handprint. It was faint, but unmistakable, as if someone had pressed their palm against the plaster with just enough force to leave a mark. My chest tightened. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? That night, I heard it breathing. It was faint, but it was there, a slow, wheezing inhale and exhale coming from the vents. I turned on every light in the apartment and stayed up until sunrise, my back pressed against the wall. When I finally worked up the courage to leave my apartment, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in jagged, spidery handwriting and read, "Don't leave." I moved out the next day, abandoning most of my belongings. When I went to hand in my keys, the landlord seemed unsurprised. He sighed and said, "I guess the place isn't for everyone." Months later, I drove past the duplex on a whim. The windows of my old apartment were dark, but Ms. Yarrow's side was lit up. And there, standing in the window, was a figure, tall and pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. It wasn't her. It's one of those habits I've had for years, born out of a desperate attempt to curb my perpetual lateness. But one Thursday morning, they weren't there. I checked my bag, my coat pockets, the couch cushions, nothing. Frustrated and already running late, I did another frantic sweep, only to find them sitting neatly on the bathroom counter, next to the sink. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness and rushed out the door. The next time was less easy to explain. My phone disappeared from the nightstand one evening while I was in the shower. I could have sworn I'd plugged it in before heading to the bathroom, but when I came back, it was gone. After 10 minutes of tearing the place apart, I found it under my bed, face down, still charging. The cord snaked perfectly from the wall, as if someone had deliberately arranged it there. It unsettled me in a way I couldn't put into words, but I told myself I must have bumped it while making the bed. Over the next week, small things kept happening. A coffee mug I distinctly remembered leaving on the counter would reappear in the sink, filled with water. A book I was reading vanished from my nightstand and showed up days later on a shelf I hadn't touched in months. My favorite sweatshirt, the one I'd been wearing when I went to sleep, was folded neatly on my dresser when I woke up. Every time I tried to rationalize it, fatigue, stress, maybe even early signs of sleepwalking, but the nagging sense of wrongness grew harder to ignore. It wasn't just the objects. There were sounds too. A faint tapping at the window, like the branches of a tree swaying in the wind, except there was no tree near my apartment. Whispers so soft, I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard them at all. Once, I was sure I heard my mother calling my name, her voice warm and familiar, like she used to sound when she'd wake me up for school. But my mother had died 3 years ago, and the memory of her voice had long since faded to static in my mind. The people were the worst. They didn't start showing up until later, when I'd already begun to doubt my own sanity. It was subtle at first. A cashier at the grocery store greeted me by name, even though I'd never seen her before in my life. A man in a suit smiled at me on the subway and said, "It's good to see you again," as if we were old friends. I couldn't shake the feeling that their faces were familiar, but I couldn't place them, like trying to recall a dream hours after waking. One night, as I was walking home from work, I noticed a woman across the street staring at me. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there under the glow of a street lamp, her head tilted slightly to the side. Something about her posture made my skin crawl, but when I turned the corner and glanced back, she was gone. By this point, I was barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd feel like someone was standing in the room with me, just out of sight. I started leaving the lights on, but that only seemed to make it worse. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't, stretching and twisting in the corners of my vision. One night, I woke up to find my closet door wide open. I could have sworn I'd closed it before bed. The darkness inside seemed deeper than it should have been, like it was swallowing the light from the room. I didn't sleep at all that night. Then things escalated. I came home from work to find my apartment completely rearranged. The couch was on the opposite side of the living room. The framed pictures on the wall were upside down. My clothes were dumped out of the dresser and piled on the floor. I called the police, convinced I'd been robbed, but nothing was missing. The locks weren't tampered with, and there were no signs of forced entry. The officer who came to check on me gave me a strange look when I tried to explain what had happened, like she didn't believe me. After that, I stopped leaving the apartment unless I absolutely had to. I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me even when I was alone. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Every flicker of the lights sent me into a spiral of panic. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They said my name over and over in voices I recognized but couldn't identify. Sometimes they begged me to come closer. Other times, they warned me to run. And then there was the mirror. I noticed it about a week ago. My reflection wasn't quite right. It moved a fraction of a second too late, like a video buffering on a slow connection. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw it smile when I wasn't smiling. It was only for a split second, but it was enough to make me scream and cover the mirror with a sheet. Yesterday, I found a note on my kitchen table. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of writing it. It said, "Stop looking for answers. You won't like what you find." I haven't left the apartment since. The lights flicker constantly now, and I swear I can hear footsteps in the hall, even though I live alone. The shadows are everywhere, stretching long fingers across the walls. Sometimes I think I see faces in them, watching me, waiting. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I'm losing my mind, or if something is playing with me, testing me. Every time I try to convince myself it's all in my head, something happens that I can't explain. Like just now, I heard a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps, steady and deliberate. I'm not expecting anyone. I didn't order anything. And yet, I feel like whoever or whatever is on the other side has been waiting for this moment for a long time. I'm not going to answer it. At least I don't think I will. But the whispers are back, louder than ever, urging me to let them in. When I moved into the apartment on Finch Street, I told myself I was finally making a smart decision. It was nothing fancy. A 1-bedroom in a 1960s-era building with scuffed hardwood floors and faintly yellowed walls. But it was close to work, cheap, and most importantly mine. No roommates leaving dishes in the sink or blasting music at 2 a.m. The landlord, a stout man named Mr. Carmichael, seemed a little distracted during the lease signing, but I chalked it up to the tiredness of someone juggling too many tenants. He handed me the keys with a quick "don't lose them," and that was that. The first few nights were uneventful. The radiator clicked and hissed like an angry cat, and the upstairs neighbor paced around at odd hours, but I wore earplugs and slept just fine. It wasn't until the 4th night that things started to feel off. I'd fallen asleep watching an old movie, and when I woke up, the apartment felt strange. Not just dark or quiet. Strange, like the air was thicker somehow. The clock on the stove said 3:12 a.m., and for a moment, I thought I'd heard faint knocking. Not at my door, but somewhere in the walls. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening. Nothing. I laughed at myself, shook it off, and went back to bed. The next morning, I wrote it off as a half-dream. New places always come with weird noises, right? Over the next week, little things began to pile up. I'd come home from work to find lights on that I swore I'd turned off. Once, my front door was unlocked. I blamed myself. Maybe I was just forgetful. But the worst was the smell. Every so often, there'd be this faint, sickly sweet odor, like rotting fruit or old garbage. It would linger for an hour or two, then vanish. I cleaned obsessively, sprayed air freshener, but it always came back. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I began to seriously question what was going on. A thunderstorm had rolled in, shaking the windows and rattling the building. I was reading in bed when I heard it again, That same faint knocking, like someone rapping their knuckles against the drywall. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It seemed to move, starting in the living room wall, then shifting toward the hallway. I turned on all the lights, heart pounding, and stood frozen as the sound stopped. I opened the door to the hallway, half expecting to see a prankster, but it was empty. Just the dim, flickering bulb and the faded carpet runner. I couldn't sleep after that. The next day, I mentioned it to Mr. Carmichael. He nodded vaguely and said, "Old pipes, probably," before quickly changing the subject to remind me about my rent due date. His indifference unsettled me. I started making notes in my phone, documenting every weird thing that happened. The knocking became more frequent, the strange smell more persistent. Then there was the time I woke up to find a single wet footprint on the bathroom floor. It wasn't mine. I set up my laptop one night and left it recording while I slept. The next morning, I played back the footage. For hours, there was nothing but the low hum of the refrigerator and my occasional snoring. But around 3 a.m., the knocking started again. This time, I could hear it clear as day. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. Then something else, a faint scraping sound like nails dragging across wood. My heart raced as I watched the screen. Nothing moved, but the sound continued for almost a full minute before stopping abruptly. I showed the video to a coworker, hoping for some logical explanation. She laughed nervously and said, "Maybe you've got a ghost." But her smile didn't reach her eyes. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the couch, clutching a flashlight, jumping at every creak and groan the building made. Around 4 a.m., I swore I saw something move in the reflection of the TV screen. Just a shadow, quick and darting out of sight. But when I turned around, nothing was there. Desperate for answers, I started asking my neighbors if they'd experienced anything strange. Most of them brushed me off, but an elderly woman on the 3rd floor stopped me in the stairwell one morning. "You're in 2B?" she asked, her voice low and wary. When I nodded, she glanced around before whispering, "That apartment's got a history. People don't stay long. A man disappeared there years ago, just up and vanished. And before that, well, some things are better left alone." I wanted to press her for details, but she shuffled away before I could say anything else. Her words stuck with me, though. That night, I decided to check the walls. I moved furniture, tapped at the plaster, looking for anything that seemed off. In the corner of the living room, behind the bookcase, I found a small square vent, almost hidden in the wall. It wasn't a normal vent. There was no airflow, no ductwork, just a black void beyond the slats. The smell was strongest there, almost unbearable. I shone a flashlight into the darkness, but couldn't see the back. I should have stopped. I know that now, but curiosity got the better of me. I pried the vent cover off and reached inside, feeling around. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. When I pulled it out, it was an old key, tarnished and heavy. Attached to it was a tag that simply read basement. The building didn't have a basement, or so I thought. There was no mention of it in my lease, and I'd never seen any stairs leading down. But the key felt important, like a clue I was meant to follow. I waited until the middle of the night, when the building was silent, and took the key downstairs. In the laundry room, hidden behind an old shelf, I found the door. The lock clicked open like it had been waiting for me. The stairs beyond were steep and narrow, leading into darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell was almost overwhelming. At the bottom, I found a small, empty room, concrete walls, a dirt floor, and something scrawled in faded paint on one wall. "Don't open the door." But there was no door, just a solid wall. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure of what to do. Then I heard it, the knocking, louder than ever, coming from behind the wall. 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 more. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the corner of the room, a shadow pulling back into the darkness. I ran. I locked the basement door behind me and didn't stop until I was back in my apartment. I shoved the vent cover back into place and spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner, clutching a kitchen knife. The next morning, I handed Mr. Carmichael my notice. He didn't seem surprised. I moved out 2 days later, leaving half my stuff behind. I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. It's faint, like it's coming from somewhere deep in the walls. I've checked every vent, every corner of my new place, but there's nothing there. Nothing I can see. Anyway, I've been working there for about 6 months. The kind of place that's eerily quiet most of the time, except for the occasional trucker stopping by for coffee or a pack of cigarettes. It wasn't the worst job. The monotony suited me, and I didn't mind being alone. I'd usually bring a book to kill the downtime or scroll through my phone when there weren't any customers. But that night, whatever it was, changed everything for me. It was just after midnight when a man walked in. He looked ordinary enough at first glance, dressed in an old gray hoodie and jeans. His face was forgettable. No distinct features, just pale and tired looking. What struck me as odd, though, was how he moved. It was too deliberate, almost like he was measuring every step. He didn't browse or even glance around like most people do. He walked straight to the counter and stared at me. His eyes, though, they were unsettling, dark, and too focused, like he was trying to see something inside me. "Do you sell flashlights?" he asked, his voice low and flat. I pointed toward the aisle where we kept them. He didn't move right away, just stood there for a second too long before finally turning and heading in that direction. I couldn't help but watch him. He didn't pick up a flashlight, didn't even seem to look at them. He just stood at the end of the aisle, his back to me, staring down at something out of my view. I busied myself restocking cigarettes, trying not to think too much about it. But then I noticed something. The man hadn't moved for several minutes. I cleared my throat loudly, hoping to break the strange tension. "Did you find what you need?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. He didn't respond. I stepped out from behind the counter, inching toward the aisle. "Sir?" I tried again. He turned so quickly that I jumped. He wasn't holding a flashlight. His hands were empty. His face looked different, paler somehow, almost waxy. He stared at me with those same unnerving eyes and said, "You should leave here." "What?" I stammered, confused and a little scared. "What do you mean?" "Not safe," he said, his voice suddenly trembling, almost like he was on the verge of tears. Before I could respond, he brushed past me and walked out, leaving the door to swing shut behind him. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My gut told me to lock the doors and call it a night, but I brushed it off as just another weird encounter. This was a gas station, after all. Strange people were par for the course. The rest of the shift was uneventful until around 2:30 a.m. I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the glass doors, but when I looked up, they were clear. No one was there. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was knocking on wood. It seemed to be coming from the back of the store, near the stockroom. I told myself it was probably just the building settling, or maybe something shifting on the shelves, but my skin was crawling. Grabbing the flashlight we kept behind the counter, I made my way to the back. The tapping stopped the moment I opened the stockroom door. The room was empty, just rows of shelves stacked with boxes and cleaning supplies. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, closer this time, like it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and I suddenly became aware of how silent it was, like the entire world had gone still. Then I heard the faintest whisper, so quiet I thought I might have imagined it. It was my name. I bolted out of the stockroom, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I locked the door behind me and tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I didn't hear or see anything else for the next hour, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to close up early and go home. It wasn't worth sticking around. As I was locking the front door, I glanced out toward the parking lot and froze. The man from earlier was standing at the edge of the lot, barely visible in the dim light. He wasn't looking at me, though. He was staring at something behind me. I turned instinctively, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. When I looked back, he was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I told my manager I was quitting. I didn't give a reason. What could I say? That I was scared of a whisper and a creepy customer? He probably would have laughed me out of the room. But here's the thing. About a week later, I ran into one of my old coworkers, and she told me something that made my blood run cold. 2 nights after I quit, another employee was working the night shift when a fire broke out in the stockroom. The fire department said it looked like it started from faulty wiring, but my coworker swore up and down that she'd heard someone whispering her name right before she smelled the smoke. I haven't set foot in that gas station since, but I can't stop thinking about the man in the gray hoodie and what he might have seen that night. I don't know what was in that store or why it seemed to be targeting the people who worked there, but I'm just grateful I got out when I did. Still, sometimes late at night, I'll hear a faint tapping sound on my bedroom window, on the walls, even on the floorboards, and I can't help but wonder if whatever it was followed me. When the listing for the house popped up, it seemed like a miracle. 3 bedrooms, a sprawling backyard, and rent so low it felt criminal. It's been on the market for a while, the agent admitted when I called. People are weird about old houses. I wasn't. I was just weird about my budget. By the end of the week, I'd signed the lease and moved in. The house was quirky in that way only old homes can be. The doors stuck on humid days, and the floors slanted slightly toward the back of the house. But it had charm. Crown molding, stained glass windows, and an antique chandelier in the dining room that cast soft rainbows on the walls when the sun hit it just right. The only downside was the attic. The agent had been vague about it. It's not really usable space, she'd said. Just storage. I didn't care. I wasn't planning to store anything up there anyway. The narrow staircase leading up to it was tucked behind a door in the hallway, and I didn't even think about it during the first few days. Then, the noises started. It wasn't loud, nothing dramatic, just a faint creaking like footsteps or the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises, right? But after the 3rd night of hearing it, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It always started around midnight, always lasted just long enough to set my teeth on edge, and always stopped the moment I tried to investigate. One night, armed with a flashlight and my dwindling courage, I opened the attic door and climbed the stairs. The air up there was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and wood rot. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a low, slanted ceiling, cobweb beams, and the usual collection of forgotten junk. A stack of yellowed newspapers, a rocking chair missing one arm, a trunk covered in scratches. Nothing unusual, except for the mirror. It was leaning against the far wall, an ornate, full-length mirror with a tarnished silver frame. It didn't fit the rest of the attic's aesthetic. It was too clean, too pristine, like it didn't belong. The glass was perfectly smooth, untouched by the grime that coated everything else. I stared at it, half expecting my reflection to do something creepy, but it just stared back, ordinary as ever. Still, something about it made me uneasy, so I left it alone. That night, the noises didn't stop. In fact, they got louder. The footsteps turned into thuds, the dragging sound more deliberate. I lay in bed, clutching the covers, too scared to move. At one point, I swore I heard a voice, soft and muffled, but I couldn't make out the words. The next morning, I tried to ignore it. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, and avoided looking at the attic door. But when I sat down to eat, I noticed something strange. The chandelier wasn't casting rainbows anymore. Instead, it threw long, jagged shadows across the walls. I stared at it, heart pounding. The crystals were still there, still catching the light, but the effect was wrong, distorted. When I went to bed, the mirror was waiting for me. It wasn't in the attic anymore. It was in my bedroom, propped against the wall like it had always been there. I didn't put it there. I stared at it. The unease from before, now a full-blown panic. My reflection stared back, but it didn't feel right. It felt delayed, like it was just a fraction of a second behind my movements. I raised my hand, and so did it. But when I lowered my hand, it hesitated before following. I covered the mirror with a sheet and slept with the lights on. The next morning, the mirror was gone. I checked the attic, the living room, every corner of the house, but it had vanished. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, I noticed the scratches on the floorboards in my bedroom, the same jagged marks I'd seen on the trunk in the attic. They led from the foot of my bed to the hallway, disappearing under the attic door. I called the agent, demanding to know if the house had a history I should know about. She was dismissive, brushing off my concerns with platitudes about old houses and their personalities. When I mentioned the mirror, there was a pause. "Mirror?" she asked. There wasn't a mirror in the attic. After that, things escalated. The noises became constant, echoing through the house at all hours. Objects began to move. Nothing dramatic, just small shifts. My keys wouldn't be where I'd left them. A chair would be slightly turned. My phone would be face down instead of face up. Subtle, gaslighting changes. And then the mirror came back. This time, it was in the hallway blocking the attic door. I wanted to throw it out, to smash it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My reflection seemed angry. Its face wasn't quite my face. It was me, but the features were sharper, the eyes darker, the expression colder. I backed away, and as I did, I saw something move behind me in the reflection. A shadow darting across the hall. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back, the mirror was gone again. By now, I was desperate. I tried to leave the house, but my car wouldn't start. My phone refused to call anyone. Every number returning a flat, robotic, disconnected tone. Even the light outside seemed dimmer, the trees bending unnaturally in the wind. It felt like the house was pulling me back, trapping me. That night, I woke up to find a mirror at the foot of my bed. This time, my reflection wasn't alone. There was a figure standing behind it, a tall, faceless shape, featureless except for its long, spindly fingers pressed against the glass. My reflection didn't react to it, didn't flinch or turn around. It just stared at me, unblinking, as the figure behind it began to move, reaching for the edges of the mirror, pushing against them, as though it were trying to break through. I don't know what happened next. I remember screaming, throwing the sheet over the mirror, and running. When I woke up, it was morning. The mirror was gone. The house is quiet now. The noises have stopped, and nothing moves out of place. But the chandelier doesn't cast rainbows anymore, and the scratches in the floor are still there. Every night, I hear faint whispers, so soft I can almost convince myself they're my imagination. Almost. I don't look at my reflection anymore. Not in mirrors, not in windows, not even in the surface of the kitchen sink. I'm too scared of what I'll see looking back. I hadn't seen Greg in years, not since college. So when he reached out and invited me to his family cabin in the mountains, I was caught off guard. We'd never been particularly close, but his message seemed earnest, almost desperate. "Just a few days," he wrote. "I could really use some company." I figured he was going through something, maybe a breakup or the kind of loneliness that creeps up on you in your 30s. Either way, I said yes. It was a slow time at work, and honestly, I needed a break. I didn't ask many questions. The cabin was impossibly remote. Greg gave me coordinates instead of an address, and even with GPS, I got lost twice. When I finally pulled up the gravel driveway, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you'd expect in the mountains. It was oppressive, as though the forest around the cabin were holding its breath. Greg came out to greet me, and I almost didn't recognize him. He looked thinner, his face drawn and pale, with dark circles under his eyes. His smile was forced, his movements jittery. I asked if he was okay, and he brushed it off, saying he hadn't been sleeping well. "I'll explain everything later," he said, but he didn't. The cabin was small but cozy. A wood-burning stove, mismatched furniture, a couple of bedrooms, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of pine. Greg insisted on making dinner, and we spent the evening catching up. It was nice, almost normal, except for the way he kept glancing at the windows. Every few minutes, his eyes would dart toward the glass, as if he were expecting to see something out there. After dinner, Greg started drinking. Not casually either. He poured himself whiskey like it was medicine, one glass after another. I tried to ask what was going on, but he kept changing the subject. Finally, after his fifth or sixth drink, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You ever feel like you're being followed?" he asked, his voice low. "Followed? Like by someone?" I said. "Not someone," he murmured, staring into his glass. "Something." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his expression didn't change. He looked at me, his eyes glassy but sharp. "I'm serious, man. There's something out there." I didn't know what to say. Like a bear or... No, he interrupted. Not an animal. It's hard to explain. He ran a hand through his hair. I didn't invite you here for company. I needed to know if it's just me. If you notice it too. I stared at him, uneasy. Notice what? Greg hesitated, then got up and went to the window. He pulled the curtain aside and gestured for me to join him. Outside, the forest was a wall of darkness, the trees silhouetted against a starless sky. I saw nothing unusual. Watch, he said. We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Just as I was about to say something, I saw it. A flicker of movement deep in the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but then I realized it wasn't moving right. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs seemed too long, bending in ways that made my stomach churn. The thing wasn't walking. It was gliding, its movements impossibly smooth. It stopped just at the edge of the tree line, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt it looking at us. What the hell is that? I whispered. Greg didn't answer. He let the curtain fall and poured himself another drink. It started a month ago, he said. I came up here to clear my head, and it found me. What does it want? I asked, my voice trembling. Greg shook his head. I don't know. It doesn't come inside, but it's always there, watching. I wanted to leave right then and there, but Greg begged me to stay. Please, he said. Just one night. I can't handle this alone anymore. Against my better judgment, I agreed. He set up a cot for me in the living room and insisted we keep the curtains closed. Whatever you do, he said, don't look outside. I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Greg had told me not to look, but the sound was maddening, relentless. I couldn't help myself. I pulled back the curtain, just a fraction, and immediately regretted it. The thing was standing right there, inches from the glass. Its face, or what passed for one, was pale and featureless, a blank oval that seemed to ripple like water. Its hands, long and spindly, rested against the window pane, tapping in a slow, deliberate rhythm. And then it tilted its head, as if it could see me, as if it knew I was watching. I stumbled back, tripping over the cot. The tapping stopped. The room was deathly quiet, and when I dared to look again, it was gone. Greg found me in the morning, curled up on the floor. He didn't ask what happened. He just handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded. He didn't look surprised. I left the cabin that afternoon. Greg didn't try to stop me. As I was packing up, he stood on the porch, staring at the woods. "Be careful," he said. "Sometimes it follows people home." I drove away as fast as I could, but the whole ride back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got home, I checked every window, every lock. Everything was secure, but that didn't help me sleep. Last night, I heard tapping on my bedroom window. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. The first thing you notice about drowning is how quiet it is. That's the lie no one tells you. Not the thrashing, not the desperate gulps of air, but the eerie silence that creeps in like an unwelcome guest. It's what I remember most from that day, though everything else came in fragmented flashes. I was 18 and invincible. At least, that's what I told myself as I joined my friends on a spur-of-the-moment trip to a secluded beach they'd heard about online. The kind of place that didn't show up on GPS, a treasure passed down by whispered rumors and bad directions. It wasn't easy to find, but once we stumbled onto it, pure magic. A crescent of golden sand hugged by cliffs on either side. The water, so blue it looked fake. There was a sign, old, sun-bleached, the kind people ignore. Something about strong currents. But we were young, cocky, and eager to impress each other. If the ocean had teeth, we didn't care. It didn't look hungry anyway. It looked beautiful. The first mistake was swimming out too far. The second was assuming that beauty meant safety. I wasn't even the best swimmer of the group. That was Taylor, with her years of competitive training. But I was loudest, first to strip down to my swimsuit and cannonball into the waves. The salt water stung, but I laughed, hearing the others cheer as they followed me in. We floated and joked, talked about nonsense. Someone suggested racing to the buoy we could just barely see in the distance, and before I knew it, we were kicking and flailing toward it. I didn't win. That was Taylor, of course, but I wasn't last either. I grinned at the others, feeling that reckless kind of triumph, like I'd just conquered something ancient and unknowable. The pull was subtle at first, like the tide playing a game. It wasn't until I tried swimming back to shore that I realized the game was rigged. Every stroke felt heavier, the shoreline shrinking instead of growing. I didn't panic right away. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the current was stronger than it looked. It didn't feel urgent. Not yet. Then Taylor shouted. Her voice cut across the water, sharp and terrified. It's pulling us out. And just like that, everything shifted. The carefree laughter dissolved into panic splashing as realization set in. We were caught in a rip current. The ocean's teeth were sharp after all. Swim sideways. Taylor screamed. She was closest to me, her face pale beneath the freckles, her eyes wide with fear. Don't fight it. Swim parallel to the shore. It made sense in theory, but in practice, every stroke felt like pushing against the weight of the world. My arms burned, my legs cramped, and the shoreline seemed impossibly far. My heart hammered in my chest, a drumbeat of pure, primal fear. The others were ahead, making slow progress, but I was falling behind. I tried not to think about it, tried to focus on moving sideways, just like Taylor said. But the current was relentless, dragging me farther and farther out. And then came the quiet. It started as exhaustion, my limbs betraying me one by one. The water was no longer something I fought. It was something I became part of, like an uninvited guest being swallowed by the floor at a party. My head dipped under, and for a moment I let it. The muffled silence was almost comforting, like slipping into a dream. Then, through the haze, I felt a hand grab my wrist. It was Taylor. She wasn't supposed to come back for me. She was supposed to save herself. But there she was, her face inches from mine, her lips moving though I couldn't hear her over the rush of blood in my ears. She was angry, or maybe determined. Somehow, she pulled me sideways, her strokes fierce and deliberate, until I felt the current change. The pull lessened, replaced by the sluggish resistance of ordinary waves. We were free of the rip, but the shore was still impossibly far. Don't stop, she yelled, her voice cutting through the fog in my mind. Don't you dare stop. I didn't. I couldn't. It wasn't pretty, the way I swam, half crawling, half sinking. Taylor stayed beside me, guiding me even as her own energy waned. By the time my feet touched the sandbar, I was too weak to stand. I collapsed, coughing and trembling, my body shaking with more than just cold. The others reached us soon after, their faces as pale as mine felt. No one spoke for a long time, the only sound the crash of the waves, mocking us for thinking we could defy them. We didn't leave right away. Someone found a blanket in the car, and we huddled together, staring at the ocean like it might lash out again. Taylor didn't say much, but she didn't have to. Her hand stayed on my shoulder, steady and grounding, a reminder that I wasn't alone. I haven't been back to that beach since. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel the pull, the way the ocean stripped away every illusion of control. But mostly, I remember Taylor's hand, the way it felt like an anchor pulling me back to life. It's strange how much weight a single touch can carry. Strange, but beautiful. The first thing I noticed was the scarf. It was draped over the arm of my couch, exactly where I'd thrown it the night before, its bright red fabric a splash of color against the muted gray upholstery. Except it wasn't mine. I don't own a red scarf. I stared at it, my toothbrush dangling forgotten from my mouth, a dollop of toothpaste threatening to drip onto my pajama shirt. For a moment, I thought maybe I was mistaken. Maybe a friend had left it behind, but no one had been over in weeks. I rinsed my mouth and grabbed my phone, snapping a picture of the scarf and sending it to my group chat with the caption, "Who left this at my place?" A series of replies trickled in over the next minute. "Not mine." "Nope, sorry." "Dude, are you okay?" By the time the responses stopped, my confusion had deepened into something darker. I picked up the scarf, running the silky fabric through my fingers. It was warm, almost unnervingly so, like it had been sitting in front of a heater. I checked the thermostat. The heat wasn't on. Still holding the scarf, I walked to the window, pushing the curtains aside to let in the pale morning light. My street was its usual sleepy self, the only sound the occasional hiss of tires on wet asphalt. I lived alone in a neighborhood where nothing ever happened, but something about the scarf made me feel watched. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it, and tossed the scarf back onto the couch. The day went on uneventfully. I worked from home, answering emails and zoning out during video calls. Every now and then, I'd glance over at the scarf. It hadn't moved, hadn't changed, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong. Around lunchtime, I decided to put it out of sight, shoving it into the hall closet with the winter coats. Out of sight, out of mind, right? But when I walked back into the living room, the scarf was on the couch again. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. It was draped across the armrest in the exact same position, like I'd never moved it. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe I'd imagined putting it in the closet. Maybe I was overtired or stressed, and my memory was playing tricks on me. But as I stood there, staring at it, I noticed something else. The scarf looked cleaner, like it had been freshly washed and pressed. I approached it cautiously, as though it might spring to life, and picked it up again. It felt even warmer than before, almost hot now, like it had been pulled from a dryer. A faint smell wafted up from the fabric, something floral and old, like lavender mixed with mothballs. My stomach turned. This wasn't possible. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of unease. I tried to ignore the scarf, leaving it where it was and focusing on work, but my mind kept drifting back to it. Every time I looked at it, I felt a strange pull, like it was daring me to touch it again. I resisted, keeping my distance. When the workday ended, I decided to leave the apartment for a while, hoping a walk would clear my head. As I locked the door behind me, I felt an immediate sense of relief. The scarf couldn't follow me, I thought. That would be absurd. I wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood, the cool evening air calming my nerves. By the time I got back, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole thing was just a weird coincidence, a product of my overactive imagination. I stepped inside, flipped on the light, and froze. The scarf wasn't on the couch. It wasn't anywhere. For a fleeting moment, I felt relief. Maybe it really had been in the closet all along. But then I noticed something else. My apartment didn't look quite right. The furniture was all in the correct places, but the angles felt wrong. The couch seemed slightly smaller, the walls a fraction closer together. The air smelled faintly of lavender. And then I saw the scarf. It was hanging from the back of the chair on my dining table, draped as casually as if I'd put it there myself. My pulse spiked, and I backed away toward the door, my hand fumbling for the knob. Before I could open it, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with shaking hands. The screen showed a notification from my group chat. "Cool scarf. When did you get it?" I stared at the message, my fingers trembling as I typed back. "What do you mean? It's not mine." The reply came almost instantly. "You posted a picture of yourself wearing it, didn't you?" My stomach dropped. I didn't remember posting anything. I opened my camera roll, scrolling through the photos. My heart stopped when I saw it. A picture of me, sitting on the couch, wearing the red scarf. In the photo, I was smiling, my face illuminated by the soft glow of the living room lamp. But I didn't remember taking the picture. And worse, the expression on my face didn't feel like mine. The me in the photo looked calm, almost smug, like they knew something I didn't. I turned off my phone and bolted for the door, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from the apartment. I ran down the stairs and into the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally stopped, I was standing in front of a small park, the streetlights casting long shadows over the empty benches. I looked down at my hands. I was holding the scarf. I don't remember picking it up. I never thought much about parking garages. They're just spaces, functional and dull, where the hum of fluorescent lights competes with the muffled squeal of tires. But now, the thought of one makes my stomach twist. Because that's where I met her. It started on a Thursday night. I was working late, trying to finish a client report. By the time I got to the parking garage, the place was nearly empty, its silence broken only by the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. My car was on the third level, so I trudged up the concrete ramps, footsteps echoing unnervingly. That's when I saw her. A woman, mid-30s maybe, in a crisp red coat. She was pacing near a small hatchback, her face pinched with worry. When she noticed me, she hesitated, then waved. "Excuse me," she called, her voice slightly shaky. "Can you help me? My car won't start." I hesitated. Everything about the scene seemed perfectly ordinary, and yet something in me screamed to keep walking. But her eyes, wide and desperate, caught me off guard. "Sure," I said, forcing a polite smile. "What's wrong?" She gestured to the car and explained that it had been acting up all week. I leaned down to peer inside, looking for the hood latch. That's when I noticed the interior. It was spotless, unnervingly so. No clutter, no water bottles, no hint that it had been driven recently. "Have you tried jumping it?" I asked, straightening. "Not yet. I don't have cables." She gave a sheepish laugh, but her smile was tight forced. I offered to grab my jumper cables from the trunk of my car. She nodded, thanking me repeatedly, her words tumbling over themselves. As I walked toward my car, I felt her eyes on me, an almost tangible weight. The unease I'd felt earlier doubled, but I shook it off. She was just nervous. People act strange when they're stressed, right? When I got back, she was leaning against the hood of her car, scrolling through her phone. "Thanks again," she said without looking up. I set to work connecting the cables, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. She wasn't watching me anymore. She was texting, her fingers moving quickly. But her posture seemed wrong somehow, stiff and deliberate, like she was performing casualness instead of living it. After a few minutes, her engine roared to life. She beamed at me, the kind of overly grateful smile that made me feel like a hero in a bad sitcom. "You're a lifesaver," she said. "Really?" I mumbled something about it being no problem and made my way back to my car, eager to leave. But as I pulled out of the garage, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw her standing there, still staring at me. My stomach dropped. It wasn't gratitude on her face. It was something else, something darker. I told myself I was overthinking it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the memory of her eyes following me. I checked the locks on my doors twice before finally falling asleep. The next day, I left work at my usual time, shaking off the weird encounter. As I stepped into the parking garage, I froze. She was there again, leaning against the same car, her red coat vibrant under the harsh lights. She smiled when she saw me, as if we were old friends. "Hey," she said, pushing off the car and walking toward me. "It's you again. Small world." My skin prickled. "Yeah, I guess so," I said cautiously. "My car's fine today, thank God," she continued, gesturing to it. "But it's funny, I was just thinking about how nice you were yesterday. And here you are, like fate or something." Fate wasn't the word I'd have used. I gave her a tight smile and kept moving toward my car. "Well, have a good night," I said over my shoulder. She called after me. "Hey, wait, I never got your name." I pretended not to hear her and ducked into my car, heart pounding. As I drove away, I checked the mirror again. She was standing there, staring just like before. That weekend, I decided to run errands early, hoping to avoid her. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the thought of seeing her again made my chest tighten. As I walked back to my car in the grocery store lot, I felt that same weight of being watched. Turning my head, I spotted her a few rows over, leaning on her cart. Her red coat stood out like blood against the drab cars around her. I froze, clutching my bags tighter. She waved, smiling like we'd bumped into each other at a party. "Hey," she called, as if the distance between us didn't exist. "Hi," I said flatly, not moving. She started walking toward me. My pulse hammered in my ears. "Funny running into you again," she said when she reached me, her tone too bright. "Are you following me?" The question hit me like a slap. "What?" I stammered. She laughed, light and carefree. "I am kidding. Relax. But seriously, this is getting weird, isn't it? We keep running into each other." It was the way she said it, with a glint in her eye that suggested it wasn't weird at all. Not to her. "Yeah, weird," I muttered, fumbling with my keys. I shoved my bags into the trunk and got into the car, locking the doors as quickly as I could. When I looked up, she was still standing there, watching me, her smile fading. For the first time, I saw the anger beneath her friendly mask. I drove straight home and double-checked all the locks. That night, I dreamt of her knocking on my door, her red coat dripping with rain, her smile impossibly wide. The next week, she stopped showing up. No red coat in the parking garage, no familiar face in the grocery store. I started to feel normal again, like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then, 2 nights ago, I found a note on my windshield. 3 words scrawled in looping handwriting. Stop ignoring me. I reported it to the building manager, who promised to review the security footage. But when he called me back, he sounded confused. There's nothing on the tapes, he said. No one came near your car all night. Last night, I woke up to a soft knock at my door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocking came again, louder this time. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the peephole, there was no one there. This morning, I found a single red thread taped to my front door. I don't know what it means, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting.